Amid the salt-stung winds of the Atlantic and the damp cobblestones of medieval ports, a small island on the edge of Europe began a journey that would redraw the map of the world. England, later Britain, was not born to rule continents. It was forged instead by invasion, scarcity, ambition, and an unrelenting relationship with the sea. From fragile wooden ships hugging coastlines to ironclad fleets that ruled entire oceans, power did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated quietly, methodically, and often brutally. The British Empire did not expand as a single act of conquest, but as a sequence of decisions made under pressure. Merchants seeking profit, monarchs seeking prestige, politicians seeking stability, and generals seeking advantage. Trade routes became lifelines, ports became fortresses, companies became states, and over time, governance stretched across oceans faster than understanding ever could. This empire would span every inhabited continent, govern hundreds of millions, and impose a shared global system of language, law, finance, and time itself. It would pioneer parliamentary rule while denying representation to many it ruled. It would abolish slavery after profiting from it. It would promise order while exporting conflict. This is not a story of simple glory or singular villainy. It is the history of power, how it is built, justified, challenged, and ultimately transformed. To understand the modern world, its borders, its institutions, its inequalities, one must first trace the rise, reach, and retreat of the British Empire. In the long centuries before empire, before maps were shaded red and oceans crossed by imperial fleets, Britain existed as a contested edge of the known world. It was not yet a center of power, but a frontier, shaped by arrival and abandonment, conquest and survival. When Roman legions withdrew in the early 5th century, they did not leave behind a vacuum so much as a question. Roads cracked, forts emptied, authority dissolved into local memory. The island was left exposed to its own geography and to those who would come next. What followed was not a single collapse, but a slow fragmentation. Roman Britain gave way to a mosaic of kingdoms, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and later Scandinavian, each carving space from the land. Power was personal, local, and unstable. Loyalty followed kinship and survival rather than institutions. Yet even in this fragmentation, patterns began to form. Kings ruled not as distant emperors, but as visible figures bound by obligation. Councils gathered. Law was spoken aloud, remembered, and enforced by community. England, still unnamed as such, was learning governance the hard way through endurance. From the east came the Anglo-Saxons, settling river valleys and fertile plains. From the north and west, Celtic societies persisted, resistant but increasingly peripheral. Then came the Vikings, not merely raiders, but settlers and traders. Their longships cut through the North Sea and up England's rivers, turning coastlines into entry points and towns into targets. Violence followed, but so did exchange. Scandinavian law, shipbuilding, and maritime skill fused with existing traditions. The sea, once a boundary, became a corridor. By the 9th and 10th centuries, England was no longer just a land to be defended. It was a territory to be unified. Kings like Alfred of Wessex did not merely fight, they organized. Fortifications were standardized, legal codes written, coinage regulated. Administration, still primitive, became intentional. These were not imperial acts, but they were foundational ones. A habit was forming. Power expressed through systems rather than spectacle. The decisive transformation came in 1066. The Norman conquest was not simply a change of rulers, it was a restructuring of society. William of Normandy brought with him a continental model of control: land surveyed, ownership recorded, obligation enforced. The Domesday Book did more than catalog property. It rendered England legible to authority. For the first time, governance could see the land it ruled. Power became measurable. Castles rose across the countryside, stone declarations of dominance planted into English soil. They were not merely military structures, but administrative centers. From them flowed taxes, justice, and command. Norman rule fused French aristocratic culture with Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, producing a hybrid system uniquely suited to durability. England became centralized without becoming static. Authority was strong, but never absolute. That tension would define its political character. English kings ruled, but they ruled under constraint. Rebellions were frequent, barons resisted, the crown negotiated. By the 13th century, this struggle produced one of England's most enduring legacies, the principle that power could be limited by law. Magna Carta was not a democratic document nor a declaration of rights for all, but it was a statement that even the king was bound. Governance was no longer personal alone, it was institutional. Geography reinforced this evolution. England's insular position offered protection from constant continental war. Invasions were possible, but costly. Armies had to cross water. This allowed internal structures to mature without the repeated devastation suffered by many European states. While France bled through dynastic wars and shifting borders, England consolidated. Its political experiments were given time. At the same time, isolation bred awareness of the sea. English rulers could not ignore it. Defense depended on ships, trade depended on ports. Coastal towns grew not as cultural centers, but as commercial nodes. Wool exports tied England to European markets. Merchants gained influence. Money began to rival land as a source of power. Slowly, quietly, England was learning that wealth could travel where armies could not. By the late Middle Ages, England was still not a great power. Its population was modest, its reach limited, its ambitions constrained by internal conflict. But beneath these limits lay something more enduring, a centralized state accustomed to law, a ruling class familiar with negotiation, a society increasingly connected to maritime trade, and an island geography that encouraged outward thinking. Empire had not yet begun, but the conditions for it, administrative discipline, naval awareness, commercial instinct, and political adaptability, were already in place. The island was still on the edge, but it was no longer inward-looking. In the centuries that followed consolidation, England's greatest battles were not always fought in open fields, but within the architecture of power itself. Authority was no longer fragile, yet it was never uncontested. Kings ruled a unified realm, but they ruled a society increasingly aware of law, privilege, and precedent. This internal tension between crown and nobility, command and consent, would quietly train England in the art of governance long before it ruled others. The medieval English state matured through friction. The crown demanded revenue for war and administration. The nobility demanded protection of their rights. From this struggle emerged institutions that were not revolutionary, but cumulative. Royal courts expanded their reach. Common law began to replace local custom, not by erasing it, but by absorbing it into a standardized legal framework. Justice became something that could be appealed, recorded, and referenced. Power left traces. Parliament, initially an advisory body summoned at the king's convenience, slowly evolved into a mechanism of negotiation. Monarchs discovered that consent could unlock taxation more reliably than force. In return, elites gained a voice, not over policy alone, but over legitimacy itself. The English state learned a crucial lesson. Durability came not from absolute authority, but from managed participation. While continental kingdoms fractured under succession crises and perpetual war, England's insular geography again proved decisive. The English Channel was narrow, but it was enough. It filtered threats. Invasions required planning, fleets, and fortune. The result was not peace, but continuity. Institutions survived long enough to develop memory. Records accumulated, offices professionalized, governance became procedural rather than reactive. The sea, meanwhile, was no longer simply a defensive moat. It was becoming an opportunity. English ports connected the island to the commercial arteries of Europe. Wool exports flowed to Flanders. Wine arrived from Gascony. Timber, iron, and salt passed through harbors that grew richer and more politically influential. Towns demanded charters. Merchants demanded protection. The crown obliged, not out of benevolence, but because commerce funded authority. This relationship between state and trade would prove transformative. Unlike land-based aristocracies, merchants measured power in contracts, routes, and risk. They thought outward. They required stability beyond borders. Gradually, English rulers began to see advantage not only in territory, but in access. Control of seas promised leverage without occupation. Ships could reach where armies could not remain. War reinforced these lessons. Conflicts with France during the late Middle Ages forced England to think logistically. Armies had to be supplied across water. Fleets had to escort, transport, and protect. Naval organization improved not from vision, but necessity. Shipyards expanded, admiralty offices formed. Maritime knowledge became state knowledge. Even failure was instructive. England's losses on the continent, particularly the erosion of its French possessions, marked a turning point. The crown's ambitions retreated from land conquest toward influence and trade. What could not be held by garrisons might be reached by ships. What could not be ruled directly might be shaped indirectly. The social consequences were profound. A political culture emerged that valued administration over spectacle. Clerks, lawyers, and financiers became indispensable. Governance relied increasingly on paperwork, seals, and standardized procedure. This was not glamorous power, but it was portable power. It could be exported. By the 15th century, England stood at a threshold. It was not yet wealthy on a continental scale. Its population remained limited. Its internal divisions had not vanished. But its state was unusually coherent. Law bound ruler and ruled. Parliament mediated authority. Commerce extended influence. The navy, though still modest, was increasingly institutional rather than ad hoc. Crucially, England had learned to think in systems. Governance was no longer defined solely by who ruled, but by how rule was exercised. This distinction mattered. Empires are not built by ambition alone. They are sustained by routines. Across the Channel, Europe churned with rivalry, innovation, and exploration. New routes were being imagined, old monopolies challenged. Knowledge was spreading faster than borders could contain it. England watched, not passively, but attentively. The island had been shaped by centuries of adaptation. It had learned restraint, negotiation, and administrative endurance. It had learned the value of the sea, not yet as a highway to empire, but as a realm of possibility. What remained was the moment when possibility would become pursuit. And that moment was approaching. By the close of the Middle Ages, England had not yet stepped onto the world stage, but it had been preparing for it, almost without realizing. The forces that would one day drive empire were already embedded in the rhythms of the state. What emerged was not a vision of global dominion, but a way of thinking, measured, adaptive, and increasingly outward-looking. The end of the 15th century found England politically stabilized but strategically constrained. Dynastic conflict had scarred the land, yet it had also reinforced the importance of order. The monarchy that emerged was cautious, centralized, and deeply aware of the cost of internal collapse. Authority, once hard-won, was now guarded. Stability became policy. This caution shaped England's outward posture. Unlike continental powers driven by territorial expansion, England's ambitions were shaped by access rather than occupation. The island's rulers understood a simple truth. Land could be lost, but systems endured. Law, finance, and administration were assets that traveled more easily than armies. The English state had learned to survive through structure, and survival had become its greatest strength. Ports along the English coast reflected this transformation. They were not imperial gateways yet, but they were rehearsals. Docks bustled with trade. Shipwrights refined hulls and rigging. Sailors carried news, goods, and experience between coasts. Navigation improved incrementally. Charts were corrected, tides studied. The sea ceased to be an unknown and became a domain to be managed. The Crown took notice. Maritime capacity, once a private or regional concern, became a matter of state interest. Ships were catalogued, naval offices expanded. Defense planning increasingly assumed that England's security and its opportunity lay beyond its shores. The Navy, still small, was becoming permanent. At the same time, England's legal and administrative culture reached a point of maturity that set it apart. Records were kept, taxes assessed systematically. Courts functioned with continuity. Power flowed through institutions rather than personalities. This mattered profoundly. When authority is predictable, it can be extended. When governance is standardized, it can be replicated. Commerce reinforced this logic. Merchants operated across borders with contracts enforced by law rather than arms. Their success depended on stability, protection, and access to distant markets. In turn, the state discovered that supporting trade strengthened revenue and influence without requiring conquest. A partnership formed, uneasy but effective, between crown and capital. England's insularity, once a defensive necessity, now fostered strategic patience. The island could observe continental struggles without immediate entanglement. It could learn from the successes and failures of others. It could wait. And beyond Europe, the world was opening. New routes were being charted. Empires rose and compete across oceans. Knowledge flowed faster than allegiance. England was no longer isolated from these developments. It was connected economically, intellectually, and increasingly aspirationally. Yet there was restraint. England did not rush headlong into expansion. It tested. It experimented. It watched rivals exhaust themselves in distant ventures. What it lacked in scale, it compensated for in adaptability. Where others conquered, England negotiated. Where others occupied, England traded. Where others ruled directly, England learned to rule indirectly. By the dawn of the early modern period, the island had become something rare, a state with limited resources but exceptional organizational capacity. Its power was not overwhelming, but it was cumulative. It did not dominate, but it endured. This was the final transformation of the island on the edge. England was no longer merely shaped by invasion and survival. It had learned governance, mastered compromise, and cultivated maritime awareness. Its institutions were prepared for distance. Its political culture was conditioned to expansion without collapse. Empire had not yet arrived. No overseas dominion had been secured. No global system imposed. But the foundations were set. The island had learned how to project itself beyond its shores, not through force alone, but through systems, ships, and strategy. And in the centuries that followed, those lessons would carry England outward, into the oceans, into commerce, and eventually into empire. Thus ended the age of preparation and began the age of expansion. In the closing years of the 15th century, the world began to feel larger and smaller at the same time. Ancient maps, once framed by myth and uncertainty, were being redrawn by sail and calculation. For generations, Europe had looked inward, its ambitions confined by familiar coasts and inherited limits. Now, those limits were dissolving. The ocean, long feared as an edge of the known world, was becoming a frontier of possibility. England watched this transformation from the margins. While Iberian powers pushed boldly into the Atlantic, England entered the age of exploration hesitantly, burdened by recent civil conflict and limited resources. It lacked the wealth of Castile, the experience of Portugal, and the political confidence of unified empires. Yet it possessed something subtler: curiosity sharpened by competition, and an island instinct that understood the sea not as an obstacle, but as a necessity. The success of Spanish and Portuguese voyages altered Europe's strategic imagination. Gold, spices, and trade routes flowed into Iberian ports. Power shifted seaward. Influence followed navigation rather than ancestry. England could not ignore what was unfolding beyond its shores. To remain absent was to accept decline. But England's entry into exploration was cautious, improvised, and often flawed. Early expeditions were financed not by vast royal treasuries, but by small groups of merchants and adventurers. Ships were lightly built, crews were inexperienced, knowledge of winds, currents, and distances was incomplete. Failure was common, ships vanished, promises went unfulfilled. Yet each voyage, successful or not, returned something valuable: information. This was exploration as apprenticeship. English sailors learned by observing others and by surviving their own mistakes. Navigation advanced incrementally. The magnetic compass, celestial calculation, and coastal mapping were refined through repetition. Shipbuilders adapted hull designs for longer voyages and harsher seas. Sail plans evolved. These were not dramatic breakthroughs, but steady improvements, quiet steps toward capability. The Crown's role remained limited but attentive. English monarchs did not yet command fleets of discovery, but they recognized opportunity when it appeared. Royal licenses were granted, charters issued, private ventures were tolerated, even encouraged, when they promised advantage without excessive cost. Exploration was not yet national policy, but it was becoming national interest. One method proved particularly attractive: privateering. Authorized raiders blurred the line between commerce and conflict, striking enemy shipping while enriching investors and weakening rivals. It was exploration armed with deniability. Through privateering, England tested maritime aggression without committing to open war. The sea became not only a route of discovery, but a theater of strategy. This reliance on semi-private initiative would shape England's imperial future. Unlike centralized empires that expanded through direct state control, England allowed individuals and enterprises to push outward first. Risk was decentralized. Success was rewarded. Failure was absorbed quietly. Over time, this created a maritime culture comfortable with uncertainty and adaptation. The psychological shift was profound. The ocean ceased to represent isolation. It became connective tissue, linking England to distant coasts, rival powers, and imagined futures. Sailors returned with stories of lands beyond Europe, of currents that carried ships farther than expected, of horizons that did not end where maps suggested they should. These stories mattered. They reshaped ambition. England's worldview expanded not through conquest, but through exposure. Knowledge accumulated in ports and taverns, in shipyards and counting houses. Exploration was no longer abstract. It was tangible, risky, and increasingly necessary. To master the sea was to secure relevance in a changing world. Still, England lagged behind. Its voyages were fewer, its rewards smaller, its presence tentative. But lateness carried advantage. England learned from others' errors. It observed how overextension strained Iberian empires. It saw how distant wealth provoked domestic tension. Patience became a strategy. By the early 16th century, England had not claimed empires, but it had claimed intent. Ships sailed farther. Mariners returned more confident. The state listened more closely. The ocean was no longer something to be endured between coasts. It was a domain to be understood, exploited, and eventually controlled. A transformation was underway, not of territory, but of mindset. England was beginning to look outward, not yet as a conqueror, but as a contender. As the 16th century advanced, England's relationship with the ocean deepened, not through triumph, but through persistence. Exploration was no longer an occasional gamble, it was becoming a practice. Each voyage added fragments of understanding, and together these fragments began to form a coherent maritime consciousness. The sea was teaching England its rules, slowly and without mercy. English sailors pushed farther into the Atlantic following rumors of northern passages and distant markets. The dream was efficiency, a route that could bypass Iberian dominance and reach Asia directly. Expeditions toward the northwest probed icy waters and hostile coastlines. They did not find the promised passage, but they charted coast after coast, mapping danger as much as opportunity. Failure refined knowledge. Survival became instruction. These journeys altered England's technical foundations. Navigation grew more precise. Latitude could be measured with increasing confidence. Logbooks captured winds, currents, and storms with obsessive detail. What began as personal experience became collective intelligence. The sea was being documented, categorized, and gradually mastered. Shipbuilding followed. English vessels adapted to longer voyages and open ocean conditions. Hulls strengthened. Cargo capacity increased. Ships were designed not only for transport, but for endurance. This was not merely innovation, it was necessity. The Atlantic demanded respect, and England was learning how to provide it. The state's involvement expanded cautiously. Monarchs still avoided massive expenditure, but they understood leverage. Strategic ports were reinforced, naval administration became more formal, dockyards gained importance, maritime skill was recognized as national security. England did not yet dominate the seas, but it was no longer improvising upon them. Competition sharpened intent. Encounters with Spanish and Portuguese fleets were not abstract rivalries. They were lived experiences. English sailors observed the vulnerabilities of heavily laden treasure ships and the fragility of extended supply lines. The sea revealed that power, even when vast, could be disrupted. This lesson would echo for centuries. Privateering intensified. Authorized captains attacked enemy commerce under legal sanction, funneling wealth back into England while avoiding the cost of standing war. It was asymmetric power, cheap, flexible, and effective. The sea allowed England to punch above its weight. Maritime conflict became economic warfare. This era also reshaped identity. The English sailor emerged as a cultural figure, hardened by wind and distance, reliant on skill rather than rank. At sea, hierarchy softened. Competence mattered. Survival demanded cooperation. This ethos would later influence how England administered distant ventures, pragmatically, often ruthlessly, but with an emphasis on function over ceremony. Ports transformed accordingly. They became centers of intelligence as much as trade. Information arrived with ships, prices, rumors, political shifts, navigational discoveries. Merchants and officials listened closely. The ocean was not just moving goods, it was transmitting knowledge. Gradually, ambition aligned with capability. England no longer saw exploration as spectacle or curiosity. It was becoming strategic. Voyages were planned with intent. Risk was calculated. Returns were measured not only in gold, but in access and influence. Still, England remained restrained. It did not seek immediate territorial conquest. Settlement was rare. Control was indirect. The focus remained on roots, disruption, and presence. This restraint was not weakness. It was calibration. England was learning the cost of distance before attempting permanence. By the mid-16th century, the transformation was undeniable. England's worldview had expanded beyond its shores. Maps hung in council chambers. Sea charts were studied alongside legal codes. The ocean had entered the political imagination. The sea was no longer unknown. It was no longer feared. It was becoming familiar. And familiarity, more than courage, is what enables expansion. Yet mastery was incomplete. England had not yet tested its maritime identity against the full weight of imperial conflict. That trial was approaching, inevitable, unavoidable, and decisive. The ocean had opened. Soon, it would demand a reckoning. By the latter half of the 16th century, England's engagement with the sea reached a turning point. What had begun as tentative exploration was hardening into strategic intent. The Atlantic was no longer merely a space to traverse. It was a field of contest where influence could be won without occupation and power projected without permanence. England had learned the ocean's grammar, and now it began to speak with confidence. The shift was driven by convergence. Maritime skill accumulated over decades of trial met political will shaped by rivalry. The Crown's restraint gave way to coordination. Naval resources were organized more systematically. Intelligence from ports fed into policy. The sea entered statecraft not as an accessory, but as a central instrument. Conflict accelerated this transformation. England's growing presence inevitably collided with Iberian dominance. Encounters at sea intensified, from skirmishes to sustained disruption of trade. English privateers targeted shipping lanes that sustained overseas empires, turning the ocean into a lever against continental power. These actions were not random acts of piracy. They were calculated operations designed to weaken rivals economically while enriching England and testing its naval capacity. The effect was cumulative. Treasure captured funded further voyages. Experience gained refined tactics. Confidence bred ambition. The sea rewarded those who understood it and punished those who assumed it was mastered. England learned quickly which assumptions were fatal. Crucially, maritime engagement reshaped England's sense of scale. Distance no longer implied disconnection. Time at sea compressed as routes improved. Information returned faster. Decision-making adapted. England began to imagine itself not as a peripheral island, but as a node in a widening network of movement and exchange. This new imagination mattered as much as any ship or chart. Expansion requires belief before it requires force. The English state was beginning to believe that its future lay outward, that relevance, wealth, and security depended on access beyond Europe. This belief did not erase caution, it disciplined it. Navigation schools emerged. Shipwrights refined standardized designs. Sailors passed down knowledge with increasing precision. What had once depended on individual daring now relied on shared systems. Maritime power was becoming institutional. At the same time, England's approach remained distinctive. It did not seek immediate control of vast territories. It tested presence before permanence. Outposts preceded colonies. Trade preceded settlement. Influence preceded rule. This sequence would define the empire that followed. The ocean enabled this flexibility. Ships could arrive, withdraw, and return. Authority could be asserted selectively. Risk could be managed. Where land empires depended on garrisons and supply lines, maritime power depended on timing and access. England found this model suited to its resources and temperament. By century's end, England had not yet founded a global empire, but it had broken decisively from medieval constraints. It was no longer bound to the rhythms of land warfare or the limits of local markets. Its future was mobile. The psychological transformation was complete. The sea had ceased to be an edge and become a center. It connected England to opportunity and danger in equal measure. It demanded coordination, discipline, and foresight. And in return, it offered reach. The ocean had also taught restraint. England had watched rivals overextend, their wealth provoking resistance and decay. It had seen how distance could magnify vulnerability. These lessons shaped a cautious confidence, an understanding that endurance mattered more than speed. By the dawn of the 17th century, England stood poised. It possessed maritime competence, strategic awareness, and a growing appetite for expansion tempered by calculation. Its ships sailed farther, its sailors returned seasoned, its leaders planned beyond coastlines. The age of exploration was giving way to something more deliberate. The ocean had opened pathways. What came next would determine whether those pathways became routes of trade or corridors of rule. As England turned from testing the seas to anchoring itself abroad, exploration would yield to settlement and presence would harden into control. The next chapter would begin not with ships alone, but with landfall. In the early 17th century, the British Empire did not announce itself with marching armies or imperial decrees. It arrived quietly, written into charters, sealed in contracts, and carried across oceans in the holds of merchant ships. Power moved not behind banners, but behind balance sheets. Where other empires advanced through crown-led conquest, England advanced through permission granted not to generals but to companies. This was a different model of expansion. The English state, still cautious and resource-constrained, did not seek to govern distant lands directly. Instead, it outsourced risk. Joint stock companies, legal entities backed by investors rather than armies, became the primary instruments of expansion. They were granted monopolies, territorial rights, and judicial authority in exchange for loyalty, profit-sharing, and strategic advantage. Sovereignty was no longer singular. It was divisible. The most consequential of these enterprises were formed not with visions of empire, but with promises of return. Investors expected dividends, not dominion. Yet embedded within these charters were powers traditionally reserved for states: the right to make treaties, raise forces, administer justice, and govern populations. Commerce and authority fused into a single mechanism. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Atlantic world. England's first permanent colonies in North America were not founded as imperial capitals, but as fragile settlements, commercial experiments balanced on survival. Jamestown, established in 1607, was not intended to become a nation. It was intended to become profitable. Its early years were marked by starvation, disease, and uncertainty. Survival depended on local alliances, environmental adaptation, and relentless improvisation. Governance emerged not from theory, but from necessity. Across the Atlantic, the Caribbean followed a harsher trajectory. Sugar islands promised immense wealth, but at catastrophic human cost. Plantation economies reshaped land and labor into instruments of extraction. Enslaved Africans were transported in vast numbers, transforming islands into engines of profit sustained by violence and coercion. The British state did not administer these systems directly, but it regulated, taxed, and defended them. Distance softened accountability. Profit hardened policy. In North America, settlement followed a different logic. Land was abundant. Labor was scarce. Colonies attracted migrants seeking opportunity, religious autonomy, or escape. Governance developed unevenly, partly imposed, partly negotiated. Local assemblies emerged, legal traditions adapted, authority fractured and reassembled across distance. These colonies were not replicas of England. They were variations, shaped by geography, demography, and economic purpose. What unified them was structure. Trade bound distant settlements into a single imperial economy. Raw materials flowed outward, manufactured goods flowed inward, capital circulated, insurance, credit, and shipping linked ports across oceans. England itself became a hub, not through domination of territory, but through coordination of exchange. Power lay in connection. The companies that enabled this system were not neutral actors. Their priorities shaped colonial life. Profit demanded efficiency. Efficiency demanded control. Control demanded governance. Over time, commercial logic began to dictate political structure. Laws were written to protect investment. Force was applied to secure trade. Administration followed commerce. The English state observed this evolution closely. It benefited enormously from it, without bearing the full cost. When ventures succeeded, revenue flowed. When they failed, losses were absorbed privately. This arrangement allowed expansion without overextension. It also embedded instability. Corporate authority was powerful but unaccountable. Decisions made in distant boardrooms reshaped lives across continents. The line between merchant and ruler blurred. This ambiguity became a defining feature of British expansion. Empire was not imposed uniformly. It accumulated through overlapping jurisdictions and competing interests. Colonies answered to companies. Companies answered to investors. Investors answered to markets. The Crown intervened selectively, asserting authority when profit or security demanded it, withdrawing when risk outweighed reward. It was an empire without a single center. Yet its effects were tangible. Landscapes were transformed. Labor systems reorganized. Indigenous societies displaced, subordinated, or destroyed. Trade networks integrated distant regions into a shared economic rhythm, one that prioritized extraction over equilibrium. Wealth accumulated unevenly, concentrating power far from the places it was produced. By mid-century, it was clear that commerce had done what conquest had not. England's presence overseas was no longer temporary. It was structural. Ships sailed on schedules. Goods moved predictably. Settlements endured. Authority, though fragmented, was persistent. Empire had not arrived through declaration. It had emerged through contract. And contracts once enforced are difficult to reverse. As England's overseas ventures multiplied, the reality of empire hardened. What had begun as speculative enterprise encountered the unforgiving limits of geography, climate, and human resistance. Profit alone could not sustain distant settlements. Survival demanded structure, and structure inevitably required power. In the Atlantic colonies, this tension played out with stark clarity. Early settlements faced collapse not because ambition was lacking, but because planning had underestimated environment. Crops failed, disease spread. Relations with indigenous peoples oscillated between cooperation and violence. Colonies learned quickly that survival depended on adaptation: agricultural, social, and political. Imported models from England were revised or abandoned altogether. Economic necessity drove innovation. Tobacco cultivation transformed Virginia from a struggling outpost into a profitable colony, but it also reshaped labor. Indentured servitude proved insufficient. Plantation agriculture demanded scale and permanence. Gradually, racialized slavery became embedded as an economic solution, justified through custom, law, and distance. What began as a labor practice became a system. What began as commerce became domination. The Caribbean accelerated this process. Sugar production required capital, machinery, and relentless labor. Islands were reorganized around export economies that left little room for social balance. Enslaved Africans outnumbered European settlers. Violence became routine. Profit margins were enormous. The British state, though not directly governing these plantations, protected their output through naval power and legislation. Wealth flowed into Britain, reshaping finance, consumption, and class. Meanwhile, North American colonies developed a different equilibrium. With larger settler populations and more diversified economies, governance evolved locally. Colonial assemblies asserted authority over taxation and law. English legal traditions adapted to frontier realities. Distance weakened direct oversight. Autonomy grew, not through rebellion, but through practice. This divergence posed a challenge. The empire was expanding, but unevenly. Different colonies served different functions. Some extracted wealth. Others absorbed population. Some required heavy coercion. Others relied on negotiation. The companies that managed these territories struggled to reconcile profit with stability. In Asia and Africa, the challenge was even greater. Trading posts were established along coasts and rivers, designed not to rule land, but to control exchange. Forts protected warehouses. Treaties secured access. Local rulers were courted, bribed, or threatened. Authority was indirect, layered atop existing systems rather than replacing them. The goal was not transformation, but reliability. Yet reliability required leverage. Companies maintained armed forces. They administered justice. They regulated trade. Over time, commercial presence expanded into political influence. Markets required order. Order required enforcement. Enforcement required legitimacy, or at least its appearance. This gradual escalation blurred boundaries further. Company officials acted as diplomats, judges, and military commanders. Decisions made to protect trade began to reshape societies. Alliances shifted power balances. Local economies reoriented toward export. Dependency replaced reciprocity. The British state could no longer remain a distant observer. As overseas interests expanded, so did the consequences of failure. Conflicts involving companies risked entangling the crown in war. Abuses threatened reputation. Disorder threatened revenue. Intervention increased. Regulation followed. Charters were revised. Oversight expanded. Parliament asserted interest in colonial administration. The relationship between state and company evolved from delegation to supervision. Commerce had built the empire, but now it demanded governance. This transition was neither smooth nor immediate. Tensions flared between investors seeking profit and officials seeking control. Colonial populations resisted external authority. Indigenous communities faced displacement and disruption. Enslaved populations resisted through flight, revolt, and endurance. Empire was no longer abstract, it was contested daily. Yet the system persisted because it adapted. When one model failed, another emerged. Failed companies were absorbed, successful ones were copied. Authority shifted incrementally from private hands to public institutions. The British Empire did not abandon its commercial origins, but it began to formalize them. By the mid-18th century, the outlines of imperial structure were visible. Trade networks spanned oceans. Colonies were integrated into policy. Corporate ambition had laid foundations that the state could not ignore. Economic logic had begun to dictate political control. Empire was no longer an experiment. It was becoming a system. And systems, once established, tend to expand. But expansion carries consequence. The more Britain relied on commerce to project power, the more vulnerable that power became to disruption, resistance, and reform. The very mechanisms that built empire would soon test its limits. By the time the 18th century approached, Britain's overseas presence had crossed an invisible threshold. What had begun as scattered ventures, fragile settlements, fortified trading posts, and speculative companies, had fused into something far more enduring. Commerce had ceased to be merely an instrument of expansion. It had become the architecture of empire itself. The transformation was subtle but decisive. Trade routes hardened into arteries. Contracts evolved into claims. Temporary authority became habitual rule. The British Empire did not suddenly declare itself sovereign over distant lands. Sovereignty accumulated through repetition. Decisions made for profit became precedents for governance. Enforcement meant permanence. Permanence demanded legitimacy. Nowhere was this clearer than in the growing interdependence between state and enterprise. The British government, once content to grant charters and collect duties, found itself increasingly bound to the success of overseas companies. Wars were fought to protect trade. Diplomacy served commercial interests. Naval power was deployed not only to defend the homeland, but to secure distant markets. The line between national interest and corporate profit dissolved. This alignment reshaped imperial priorities. Expansion was no longer driven by ideology or faith, but by calculation. Territories mattered insofar as they produced revenue, secured routes, or denied advantage to rivals. Governance became pragmatic. Where indirect control sufficed, it was preferred. Where resistance threatened stability, force followed. Flexibility became doctrine. Yet this flexibility carried contradiction. Company rule was efficient but unstable. Its legitimacy rested on profit, not consent. Corruption flourished in distance. Abuses multiplied where oversight thinned. Local populations were governed by policies designed thousands of miles away, optimized for return rather than welfare. Resistance grew, not always in open revolt, but in quiet defiance, flight, and refusal. The British state responded unevenly. Sometimes it intervened decisively, absorbing company territories into direct rule. Other times it tolerated excess, calculating that reform would cost more than repression. Empire advanced through compromise between morality and money, order and opportunity. At the same time, Britain itself was changing. Wealth generated overseas reshaped domestic society. Ports expanded, finance matured. Insurance, banking, and credit systems grew in sophistication, all tied to imperial trade. London emerged as a global hub, not of production, but of coordination. Decisions made there rippled outward across oceans, shaping labor systems, land use, and political structures far beyond Britain's shores. This concentration of influence reinforced imperial momentum. Empire fed prosperity, prosperity fed power, Power fed further expansion. The cycle appeared self-sustaining. But it also bred dependency. The British state became increasingly reliant on overseas revenue. Colonial economies were restructured to serve imperial needs, narrowing their resilience. Trade networks bound distant regions into a single system vulnerable to disruption. A shock in one part of the empire could reverberate across continents. And beneath the surface, tension accumulated. Colonial assemblies in North America grew accustomed to autonomy. Enslaved populations resisted relentlessly. Indigenous societies adapted, resisted, and survived in fragmented ways. Company officials wielded authority without accountability. The empire functioned, but it was strained. What had once been England's advantage, delegated risk, now became a liability. The state could no longer distance itself from the consequences of corporate rule. Failure abroad threatened credibility at home. Disorder overseas demanded intervention. The empire required coherence. Gradually the balance shifted. Parliament asserted greater authority. Charters were revoked or restructured. Territories passed from company control to crown administration. Commerce had built the framework, but the state now moved to solidify it. Empire was becoming formal. This transition marked the end of the empire's experimental phase. The age of contracts was giving way to the age of administration. Britain had learned that profit could open doors, but only governance could keep them open. By the mid-18th century, the British Empire stood as a vast, uneven system, part commercial network, part political entity. Its power did not rest on conquest alone, but on its ability to integrate trade, law, and force into a single operating logic. It ruled not everywhere directly, but it influenced almost everywhere that mattered to its economy. Empire, once accidental, was now intentional. The companies had done their work. They had mapped routes, tested models, and built foundations. What followed would no longer be led by merchant alone. The next era would belong to the state, to war, consolidation, and the pursuit of supremacy on a global scale. And as commerce yielded to command, Britain would discover what it truly meant to rule an empire. By the opening decades of the 18th century, Britain had crossed a decisive threshold. It was no longer merely an expanding power. It had become a commercial system on a global scale. Empire was now measured less by flags planted on land than by routes controlled at sea. The world Britain shaped was not contiguous, but connected by shipping lanes, contracts, credit, and cannon. This was an empire built on movement. Across the Atlantic and beyond, British ships threaded predictable paths between continents. Sugar from the Caribbean flowed to Europe. Tobacco and rice from North America entered global markets. Textiles, metal goods, and finished manufactures moved outward in return. These exchanges were not isolated transactions. They were components of an integrated circuit. Ports became nodes. Oceans became infrastructure. Naval supremacy made this possible. Britain did not rely on massive standing armies to hold territory. Instead, it invested in ships, fleets capable of protecting commerce, disrupting rivals, and enforcing access. Control of the sea did not require occupation of land. It required presence, timing, and force at critical points. Choke points mattered more than borders. Routes mattered more than regions. This strategy suited Britain's resources and temperament. An island state with limited manpower but strong maritime tradition, Britain learned to project power efficiently. Ships could be deployed flexibly, withdrawn when necessary, and concentrated where advantage demanded. Naval power protected trade, and trade, in turn, funded the Navy. The relationship was circular and self-reinforcing. At the heart of this system stood London. By the 18th century, the city had transformed into more than a capital. It became a clearinghouse for global exchange. Merchants gathered information faster than governments. Prices, risks, and opportunities were calculated daily. Insurance markets spread risk across investors. Banks extended credit beyond borders. Capital flowed ahead of armies, shaping outcomes before conflict ever arrived. This financial sophistication was not accidental. It emerged from necessity. Long-distance trade was perilous. Ships sank, cargoes spoiled, wars disrupted routes. To profit from uncertainty, Britain learned to manage it. Risk became a commodity. Insurance and credit allowed ventures to scale beyond individual wealth. Losses were absorbed collectively. Gains were amplified. This capacity to underwrite risk distinguished Britain from many rivals. It allowed the empire to expand without exhausting the state. Private capital financed public power. The state, in turn, protected private interest. Together, they formed a system that rewarded expansion and penalized retreat. But the wealth generated by this system rested on unequal foundations. Nowhere were its contradictions clearer than in the Atlantic economy. Plantation agriculture produced immense profits, but it depended on coerced labor. Enslaved Africans were transported in staggering numbers, sustaining industries that enriched Britain while brutalizing millions. The trade in human beings was not a marginal activity. It was central to imperial commerce. Ships, ports, insurers, and investors all benefited. This exploitation was structured, legal, and normalized. Laws protected property over people. Distance softened moral scrutiny. Profit justified practice. The empire's commercial logic reduced human lives to units of labor and loss. Wealth accumulated in Britain while suffering was externalized. Yet Britain did not perceive itself as uniquely cruel. It saw itself as efficient. This distinction mattered. The empire's self-image was grounded not in conquest, but in commerce. Trade as civilization, markets as order. Economic dominance was framed as mutual benefit, even when the balance was profoundly unequal. Foreign policy followed this logic. Britain intervened abroad not primarily to annex territory, but to secure markets and routes. Wars were fought to protect trade flows, disrupt competitors, and maintain access. Diplomacy served commerce. Treaties opened ports, naval power enforced compliance. This approach reshaped global politics. States that controlled land but lacked maritime reach found themselves constrained. Empires built on territorial conquest struggled to match Britain's flexibility. Sea power allowed Britain to strike where rivals were weakest, at supply lines, at revenue streams, at points of connection. By mid-century, the outlines of a global trading empire were unmistakable. Britain's influence extended far beyond its formal possessions. It shaped prices, dictated routes, and coordinated capital across continents. Its ships were familiar sights in distant harbors. Its merchants negotiated from positions of strength. But this dominance carried tension. The system depended on stability, but generated inequality. It promised order, but produced displacement. It accumulated wealth, but concentrated power far from those who produced it. These contradictions were not yet resolved. They were merely managed. Empire at this stage appeared triumphant. Its foundations were economic. Its reach was maritime. Its confidence was absolute. Yet beneath the surface, pressure was building, among rivals, among subjects, and within Britain itself. A system so vast could not expand indefinitely without challenge. And challenges were coming. As Britain's commercial empire matured, trade ceased to be a collection of ventures and became a governing principle. Markets no longer followed power. Power followed markets. The empire's arteries, shipping lanes, credit networks, and supply chains began to dictate where Britain intervened, how it fought, and what it defended. This was not empire by proclamation, but by circulation. At sea, Britain refined a doctrine that privileged access over occupation. Naval patrols safeguarded routes rather than territories. Convoys reduced loss. Blockades strangled rivals without the cost of invasion. The ocean became a space of continuous pressure, where commerce and conflict overlapped seamlessly. War was no longer episodic. It was embedded in trade itself. This integration reshaped Britain's global posture. Decisions once considered military were now economic calculations. A threatened sugar island mattered because it financed fleets. A contested port mattered because it connected markets. The state learned to prioritize nodes, harbors, straits, and entrepôts where leverage was greatest. Control of a few key points could shape outcomes across entire regions. Finance amplified this leverage. Credit allowed Britain to mobilize resources faster than its rivals. Government borrowing was underwritten by confidence in trade revenues. Investors trusted the system because it had proven resilient. Losses occurred, but they were absorbed. Risk, diversified across ventures and oceans, became manageable. The empire could sustain long conflicts precisely because it did not rely solely on taxation or plunder. It relied on circulation. Yet circulation bred dependency. Colonial economies were increasingly shaped to serve imperial demand. In the Caribbean, monoculture deepened vulnerability. In North America, export crops tethered regions to British markets. In Africa and Asia, trade patterns redirected production toward imperial needs. Local resilience diminished as integration increased. Prosperity flowed unevenly, concentrating capital in Britain while narrowing options elsewhere. This imbalance was not accidental. It was structural. The empire's trading system rewarded specialization that benefited the center. Finished goods flowed outward, raw materials flowed inward. Value was added in Britain, extraction occurred abroad. Over time, this pattern hardened into expectation. Markets adjusted, labor systems adapted, often through coercion. Slavery remained central to this economy. Enslaved labor did not merely supply plantations, it stabilized prices, underwrote credit, and justified expansion. The human cost was immense, but it was rendered invisible by distance and normalization. The empire's wealth was inseparable from this exploitation, even as moral unease began to surface. That unease did not immediately alter policy. Profit still outweighed principle. Reform moved slowly, constrained by vested interests and geopolitical competition. Britain's rivals also depended on similar systems. To withdraw unilaterally risked disadvantage. Commerce disciplined morality. Foreign relations reflected this calculus. Britain negotiated access aggressively, using treaties to pry open markets and naval power to enforce compliance. Where diplomacy failed, intervention followed. The justification was rarely conquest. It was stability. Disorder threatened trade. Trade funded security. Security demanded intervention. The logic was circular and compelling. This cycle produced a particular imperial temperament, confident, pragmatic, and increasingly assertive. Britain did not need to rule everywhere to shape outcomes. Influence was enough. Presence was enough. A squadron offshore could compel compliance as effectively as an army ashore. Rivals responded. France sought to rebuild maritime capacity. Spain defended treasure routes with greater force. Competition intensified across oceans, transforming trade disputes into global conflicts. The empire of trade required constant vigilance. Supremacy was not permanent. It had to be renewed daily. Within Britain, the effects were transformative. Wealth from trade reshaped society. Consumption expanded. Urban centers grew. Political influence shifted toward mercantile and financial interests. Parliament reflected these changes. Policy increasingly aligned with commercial priorities. The empire's center of gravity moved decisively toward the sea. Yet success carried fragility. The more Britain depended on trade, the more exposed it became to disruption. A blockade, a rebellion, or a financial panic could ripple across the system. The empire's strength, interconnection, was also its vulnerability. By the mid-18th century, Britain presided over a global trading system unrivaled in scale and sophistication. Its ships were faster, its finance deeper, its strategy refined. But the system demanded protection. Rivals challenged roots. Colonies chafed under constraint. Moral questions pressed against economic realities. Trade had become empire. And empire, sustained by trade, now faced the test of conflict, on a scale that would determine whether Britain's commercial supremacy could endure. By the latter half of the 18th century, Britain's commercial empire stood at its zenith, vast, interconnected, and formidable. The machinery of trade, finance, and naval power operated with an efficiency unmatched by any rival. Goods moved with rhythm, capital flowed with confidence, fleets patrolled the oceans with practiced authority. Britain had achieved what few states in history ever managed: dominance without continuous occupation, control without constant conquest. Yet supremacy came with consequence. The very success of Britain's trading empire intensified the contradictions embedded within it. Wealth accumulated rapidly but unevenly. In Britain, prosperity reshaped cities and social structures. In colonies, economic integration narrowed autonomy. Markets that once promised opportunity increasingly dictated dependency. What appeared as order from London often felt like constraint from afar. These tensions were most visible in the Atlantic world. Colonial economies, structured to serve imperial demand, became vulnerable to shifts in policy and price. Merchants prospered, producers bore risk. Local decision-making gave way to metropolitan priorities. Assemblies debated taxation, regulation, and rights within an imperial framework that offered little reciprocity. Autonomy, once tolerated, now appeared inconvenient. At the same time, moral pressure mounted. The human cost of empire, long ignored or rationalized, became harder to dismiss. The transatlantic slave trade, foundational to Britain's wealth, drew increasing scrutiny. Abolitionist voices challenged the legitimacy of profit built on coercion. Yet reform threatened economic disruption. Plantation interests resisted. Financial institutions hesitated. The empire's conscience clashed with its calculus. Britain navigated this tension cautiously. Moral reform advanced slowly, constrained by competition and dependency. The state weighed ethics against advantage. Commerce, still central to power, shaped outcomes. Change came incrementally, not as rupture, but as negotiation. Rival powers tested Britain's supremacy. Naval conflicts escalated. Wars expanded beyond Europe into global theaters, where trade routes and colonies became battlegrounds. Britain's strength lay in endurance. Its ability to finance long wars, replace losses, and sustain fleets allowed it to outlast opponents. Victory often arrived not through decisive battles, but through attrition, economic and logistical. This resilience reinforced Britain's confidence in its model. Trade funded war. War protected trade. Supremacy appeared validated. Yet the costs were mounting. Debt accumulated. Colonies absorbed pressure. Resistance hardened. The system, though powerful, was no longer frictionless. Crucially, Britain's commercial empire had altered the meaning of power itself. Authority was no longer defined solely by territory, but by influence over flows of goods, capital, and labor. Control of movement mattered more than control of land. This redefinition shaped how Britain understood security and threat. Disruption anywhere within the system was a challenge everywhere. The empire's reach, once an advantage, now demanded constant maintenance. Patrols expanded, administration grew, intervention became routine. The state could no longer rely solely on markets to regulate outcomes. Governance crept forward, filling gaps commerce could not manage. By the century's end, Britain stood at a crossroads. Its empire of trade had delivered wealth and influence beyond precedent, but it had also generated inequality, resistance, and moral reckoning. The system that elevated Britain now constrained its choices. Retreat risked collapse, reform risked instability, continuation risked conflict. Empire had become inseparable from Britain's identity. Trade was not merely economic, it was political. Finance was not merely transactional, it was strategic. Naval power was not merely defensive, it was structural. The contradictions could no longer be deferred indefinitely. What followed would test whether Britain's commercial supremacy could withstand transformation, whether a system built on circulation could survive the demands of accountability, representation, and control. The age of trade had forged an empire. The age ahead would determine how that empire defended, justified, and reshaped itself. As commerce reached its limits, Britain would turn increasingly to force, not to replace trade, but to protect it. The next chapter would unfold not in counting houses or ports, but in war. A struggle for supremacy that would decide the fate of Britain's global system. In the 18th century, Britain's empire of trade entered its most dangerous phase. Commerce had carried British influence across oceans, but war would decide whether that influence could endure. The sea lanes that sustained wealth now became battlefields, ports that anchored trade became targets. Empire, once built through calculation and contracts, was forced to prove itself through conflict. This was not a single war, nor a single enemy. It was a prolonged struggle for supremacy against rival European powers, chief among them France and Spain, whose own imperial ambitions collided with Britain's expanding system. These conflicts were global in scope, fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. For the first time, war itself became worldwide. Britain entered this era with advantages and vulnerabilities. Its navy was formidable, but expensive to maintain. Its trade networks were vast but exposed. Its colonies were productive but increasingly assertive. War tested not only Britain's military capacity, but the coherence of its imperial structure. To fight effectively, the empire had to coordinate across distance, align commercial interest with state strategy, and extract resources without provoking collapse. The early wars revealed both strength and strain. Naval engagements demonstrated Britain's growing mastery of the seas. Fleets protected convoys, blockaded rivals, and severed supply lines. Victory at sea translated directly into economic pressure. A rival deprived of trade was a rival weakened without invasion. This reinforced Britain's belief that maritime dominance, not territorial conquest, was the key to imperial survival. But war demanded more than ships. Colonies were drawn into conflict as suppliers, staging grounds, and battlegrounds. Local militias fought alongside imperial troops. Colonial economies were disrupted by requisition and blockade. Protection came at a price, and that price was increasingly extracted through taxation and regulation. What had once been a loose commercial relationship hardened into obligation. This shift altered colonial perception. In North America, colonies that had grown accustomed to autonomy now faced tighter imperial control. Taxes levied to fund defense sparked resentment. Colonists questioned why they should bear costs imposed by distant decisions. The logic of empire, trade for protection, began to fracture. Distance compounded the problem. Orders traveled slowly. Conditions changed faster than policy could adapt. Commanders acted independently. Local priorities diverged from metropolitan strategy. Empire was proving difficult to fight as a single unit. Yet Britain endured and learned. Each war refined imperial practice. Administration became more centralized. Military logistics improved. Intelligence gathering expanded. The state intervened more directly in colonial affairs, recognizing that commerce alone could not sustain conflict. Governance began to replace improvisation. Authority tightened, not out of ideology, but necessity. The consequences were transformative. War clarified Britain's priorities. Some colonies mattered more than others. Some routes were indispensable. The empire began to distinguish between possessions that generated wealth and those that consumed resources. Strategic thinking sharpened. Empire was no longer experimental. It was strategic. At the same time, victory bred confidence. Britain emerged from major conflicts with expanded territory and diminished rivals. French influence receded in key regions. British control of the seas appeared secure. By mid-century, Britain stood as the dominant naval power in the world. But success masked fragility. The cost of war mounted, debt soared, colonies grew restless, the empire's reach exceeded its ability to govern comfortably. The assumption that loyalty followed protection proved false. War had united the empire under threat, but it also exposed its fault lines. Most dangerously, Britain had come to rely on its colonies not just for trade, but for strategic depth. Losing them would mean more than lost revenue. It would mean lost identity. The empire had been built outward from the Atlantic. Its psychological center lay there. That center was about to be challenged. As Britain pressed its advantage and tightened control, resistance hardened, especially in North America. What began as dispute over taxation and authority would soon escalate into something far more consequential. War had forged Britain's imperial power. But the next conflict would test whether that power could survive descent from within. By the mid-18th century, Britain stood at the height of its wartime confidence. A succession of global conflicts had confirmed what merchants and admirals already believed: control of the seas could decide the fate of empires. Naval victories translated into territorial gains. Rivals were pushed from strategic regions, trade routes bent increasingly toward British ports. On paper, the system worked. In practice, it strained. The wars that elevated Britain to supremacy were vast in scope and relentless in cost. They demanded unprecedented coordination across oceans and continents. Soldiers, sailors, supplies, and silver had to move in synchrony. Colonial ports became arsenals. Plantations became provisioning centers. Finance became a weapon, sustaining campaigns long after rivals exhausted their treasuries. Britain's capacity to endure prolonged conflict was remarkable. Its credit system allowed it to borrow at scale. Its navy replaced losses faster than enemies could. Its commanders adapted tactics to global conditions. When one theater stalled, another advanced. Supremacy emerged not from single decisive victories, but from accumulated advantage. Nowhere was this clearer than in North America. British forces displaced rival European claims, securing vast territories and seemingly removing the last major obstacles to continental dominance. From London's perspective, the result was triumph. From the colonies' perspective, it was transformation. The removal of external threats altered the balance between protection and autonomy. Colonists no longer saw imperial oversight as necessary insurance. They saw it as intrusion. The aftermath of victory proved more destabilizing than defeat. War had left Britain deeply indebted. The logic of imperial governance hardened. If colonies benefited from protection, they should contribute to its cost. Taxes and regulations followed, not to punish, but to stabilize. Yet these measures collided with colonial political culture. Assemblies accustomed to self-governance resisted external authority. Arguments turned from policy to principle. What had once been a partnership began to feel like subordination. The imperial state, for its part, misunderstood the depth of this shift. It treated resistance as ingratitude rather than structural dissent. Distance dulled perception. Officials underestimated how profoundly colonial identity had evolved. These societies were no longer extensions of Britain. They were communities shaped by their own institutions, expectations, and sense of legitimacy. As disputes escalated, the empire's contradictions came into focus. Britain championed constitutional limits at home, yet enforced parliamentary authority abroad without representation. It defended liberty in theory, yet constrained it in practice. These tensions were not new, but war had sharpened them. When conflict erupted, it exposed the limits of imperial power. Britain possessed overwhelming naval strength, yet struggled to impose control over distant territory populated by resistant communities. Sea power could isolate, blockade, and punish, but it could not easily compel loyalty. The empire discovered that dominance of routes did not guarantee obedience on land. The loss of the American colonies was more than territorial. It was psychological. For decades, the Atlantic world had been Britain's imperial core, the proving ground of its commercial and naval strategy. To lose it forced a reckoning. Assumptions about authority, loyalty, and governance were overturned. Empire, it seemed, could not be held together by protection and profit alone. Yet Britain did not collapse. Instead, it recalibrated. The rupture prompted a fundamental reassessment of imperial priorities. Settlement colonies that demanded autonomy appeared increasingly costly. Territories requiring constant negotiation seemed unreliable. Attention shifted toward regions where control could be exercised more directly, through administration rather than representation. Asia, in particular, emerged as a new focus. There, British power rested less on settler populations and more on trade dominance, alliances, and administrative leverage. Governance could be imposed without the same expectations of political inclusion. The lessons of Atlantic failure informed this approach. Empire would be reorganized, not abandoned. War had refined Britain's understanding of power. It had revealed that supremacy was not merely about winning battles, but about managing consequences. That territory could be gained and lost. That commerce could provoke resistance as easily as it generated wealth. And that distance magnified every miscalculation. By the close of the 18th century, Britain remained the foremost imperial power, but it was a chastened one. Its strategy was evolving. The age of expansion through settlement was giving way to an age of consolidation through governance. The empire would continue, but it would not look the same. War had tested Britain's system to its breaking point. What survived would shape the empire's future. In the aftermath of rupture, Britain confronted a truth it could no longer postpone. Supremacy won at sea did not guarantee cohesion on land. The loss of the American colonies forced the empire to re-examine the relationship between power and permanence, between victory and governance. What emerged from this reckoning was not retreat, but reconfiguration. The wars of the 18th century had proven Britain's ability to fight globally. They had also revealed the cost of holding territories populated by communities that demanded political voice. Settlement colonies, once the backbone of imperial expansion, now appeared unpredictable. Their loyalty could not be secured by naval protection alone. Representation mattered. Distance mattered. Identity mattered. Britain adjusted accordingly. Imperial strategy shifted away from societies that resembled Britain itself and toward regions where authority could be exercised through administration rather than consent. The empire's center of gravity moved eastward. Asia, long a theater of trade, became a theater of rule. There, British influence had grown through companies, treaties, and economic leverage rather than mass settlement. Control could be layered atop existing structures. Power could be indirect but decisive. War had prepared the ground for this transition. Global conflict had expanded Britain's military and bureaucratic capacity. Armies accustomed to distant campaigns learned logistics and command across cultures. Naval dominance ensured access, finance sustained long commitments. These capabilities, forged under wartime pressure, were now redirected toward consolidation. The logic was clear. Empire would endure not by reproducing British society abroad, but by governing difference. This approach demanded discipline. Administration replaced improvisation. Law replaced charter. Company power, once tolerated for convenience, came under scrutiny. Where corporate authority threatened stability or reputation, the state intervened. The lessons of North America, where delegated authority had drifted beyond control, loomed large. At the same time, Britain refined its use of force. Military action became more selective, more calculated. Wars were fought to secure strategic advantage rather than territorial spectacle. Supremacy meant shaping outcomes, not occupying every space. Influence mattered more than ownership. These adjustments did not resolve the empire's contradictions, but they managed them. Slavery remained entrenched even as moral opposition grew. Economic extraction continued even as resistance adapted. The empire was learning to contain dissent rather than eliminate it. Stability, not justice, guided policy. Yet the psychological impact of loss lingered. Britain's imperial identity had been formed in the Atlantic. To lose that core forced humility and innovation. The empire that followed was more bureaucratic, more centralized, and more conscious of limits. It sought control through governance rather than allegiance. By the early 19th century, Britain stood as the world's foremost imperial power, not because it held the most land, but because it commanded the systems that moved the world. Trade routes, financial markets, and naval access remained firmly in its grasp. Rivals had been diminished, supremacy endured. But it was no longer naive. War had stripped away illusion. It had shown that empire was not a single arc of expansion, but a sequence of adjustments. That loss could instruct as much as victory, and that power to last had to evolve. The age of supremacy had ended the empire's adolescence. What followed would be its maturity. An era defined less by conquest than by administration, less by exploration than by rule. As Britain turned from winning wars to managing dominion, it would confront the greatest challenge of all: how to govern a world it had helped to remake. The empire had survived war, but its future would be decided in peace. In the dawn of the 19th century, the British Empire found its center of gravity shifting decisively eastward. The Atlantic world that had once defined imperial ambition no longer held the same promise or the same certainty. In its place stood India, vast, populous, ancient, and immeasurably complex. What Britain would become as an empire would now be decided there. India was not conquered in a single moment. It was absorbed slowly, unevenly, and often unintentionally. British presence on the subcontinent had begun centuries earlier as commerce, not conquest. Trading posts clung to coastlines, forts guarded warehouses, merchants negotiated with local rulers who possessed armies, revenue systems, and long-established legitimacy. For generations, the British were guests, sometimes useful, sometimes tolerated, sometimes resented. What changed was not ambition alone, but circumstance. As the Mughal imperial structure weakened under internal strain and regional fragmentation, power dispersed. Authority shifted from centralized rule to competing courts, princes, and warlords. This instability created opportunity. British commercial agents, backed by military force and financial discipline, found space to maneuver. Alliances were forged, conflicts were exploited, protection was offered at a price. The transformation from trade to rule was incremental. Company officials did not arrive with a blueprint for empire. They reacted to threats, seized advantage, and improvised governance where none existed. Victory in one conflict led to responsibility for territory. Responsibility demanded administration. Administration demanded authority. Step by step, commerce hardened into dominion. By the early 19th century, Britain was no longer merely trading in India, it was governing it. This governance rested on a paradox. Britain ruled a civilization far older and more populous than itself, yet justified authority through claims of efficiency, order, and improvement. The language of rule was managerial rather than imperial. British officials spoke of stability, law, and progress. Empire presented itself not as domination, but as stewardship. To make this claim plausible, Britain leaned heavily on structure. A vast bureaucracy emerged, staffed by officials trained to administer rather than to conquer. Revenue systems were standardized, legal codes codified. Surveys mapped land, people, and resources with unprecedented precision. India became legible to the state in ways it had never been before. Power flowed through files, courts, and timetables as much as through force. Local elites were not erased. They were incorporated. Princes retained titles. Landholders collected revenue. Customary authority persisted, but only insofar as it aligned with imperial priorities. Rule was layered, indirect, and adaptive. British authority sat atop existing systems, reshaping them without fully replacing them. Infrastructure became both symbol and instrument of control. Roads extended administrative reach. Railways bound distant regions into a single economic network. Telegraph lines collapsed distance, allowing decisions made in Calcutta or London to reverberate across the subcontinent within hours. These technologies were presented as gifts of modernity, but they served extraction as much as integration. Economic priorities shifted accordingly. India's economy was reorganized to serve imperial demand. Raw materials flowed outward. Manufactured goods flowed inward. Traditional industries declined. Dependency deepened. Prosperity became uneven. Vulnerability widespread. Famines exposed the cost of efficiency without equity. Resistance was constant. Sometimes it took the form of rebellion, sometimes of refusal, evasion, or adaptation. Local communities resisted new taxes, land systems, and legal impositions that disrupted social balance. Cultural distance magnified misunderstanding. British officials often interpreted resistance as disorder rather than dissent. Control tightened. Authority expanded. Yet Britain also learned in India. The subcontinent forced the empire to refine its administrative capacity beyond anything previously attempted. Governing scale demanded coordination, specialization, and discipline. India became a laboratory of rule, where imperial techniques were tested, refined, and exported elsewhere. Census, survey, legal codification, and indirect governance all matured here. At the same time, India exposed the empire's moral fragility. The language of improvement could not conceal the reality of coercion. The promise of order could not erase suffering. British rule delivered stability, but at immense human cost. This contradiction lay at the heart of the Raj. India was not merely another possession. It was the empire's proving ground and its mirror. What Britain practiced there would shape how it ruled everywhere else. And what India endured would ultimately shape how the empire was judged. The Raj had begun. As British rule deepened across the subcontinent, empire in India ceased to be episodic and became systemic. What had once depended on opportunistic alliances and military advantage now relied on routine. On files processed, taxes collected, disputes adjudicated, and distances measured. Power settled into procedure. The Raj learned to govern by habit. This machinery was vast. At its core stood a professional administrative class trained to manage complexity with detachment. Officials rotated through districts, learning local languages, customs, and constraints, not to assimilate, but to administer efficiently. Authority flowed downward through hierarchies carefully insulated from local pressures. Decision-making emphasized uniformity over nuance, order over negotiation. Law became the empire's preferred instrument. British legal codes replaced or restructured indigenous systems, promising clarity and consistency. Courts standardized judgment. Contracts were enforced with rigor. Property rights were codified. These reforms were presented as rational and impartial, but they often disrupted long-standing social arrangements. Communal land systems were redefined. Customary practices were subordinated to written statute. Legal certainty for the state produced uncertainty for society. Sut. Revenue collection revealed the empire's priorities most starkly. Land assessments sought predictability, not resilience. Taxes were fixed even when harvests failed. Efficiency replaced flexibility. When scarcity struck, systems designed for extraction proved ill-suited to relief. Famines exposed the human cost of bureaucratic distance. Suffering was documented meticulously, but alleviation remained secondary to fiscal stability. Infrastructure expanded relentlessly. Railways stitched together regions that had once been economically distinct. Grain could now be moved quickly, but so could troops. Telegraphs collapsed distance, enabling centralized control. Roads linked markets to ports, accelerating export. These projects transformed India's physical and economic landscape. They also embedded imperial logic into daily life. Movement followed imperial needs. Connectivity served extraction. Yet resistance did not vanish beneath this machinery. It adapted. Local revolts erupted periodically, some coordinated, others spontaneous. The great uprising of the mid-19th century shocked the empire. revealing how fragile control remained beneath administrative confidence. The response was decisive. Military repression was severe. Company rule gave way to direct crown governance. The lesson was clear. Commerce alone could not sustain rule. Authority required accountability to the state. Afterward, governance hardened. Surveillance expanded. Intelligence networks grew. The empire invested in understanding dissent, not to address its causes, but to preempt its expression. Education was reshaped to produce intermediaries, clerks, lawyers, and officials who could operate within imperial systems. A new elite emerged, fluent in British norms, yet rooted in local society. This class would become both collaborator and critic. Cultural policy reflected imperial anxiety. British officials oscillated between reform and preservation, seeking to modernize selectively while avoiding disruption that might provoke unrest. Religious practices were alternately ignored, regulated, or instrumentalized. Identity became a tool of governance. Differences were categorized, recorded, and sometimes amplified. Despite this control, the Raj remained dependent on cooperation. Britain governed India with relatively few Europeans. Rule relied on local intermediaries, princely states, and administrative continuity. This reliance imposed restraint. Excessive coercion risked paralysis. Authority had to appear legitimate, even when it was imposed. India, in turn, shaped Britain. The demands of governing the subcontinent transformed imperial capacity. Administrative techniques developed in India were exported across the empire. The language of rule, efficiency, improvement, neutrality, became imperial doctrine. India was not just ruled by Britain, it trained Britain to rule. But the moral tension deepened. British officials increasingly recognized the gulf between imperial ideals and lived reality. Reports documented poverty alongside profit, stability alongside suffering. Reform was debated but constrained by fear of disruption. The empire hesitated, aware of its contradictions, yet invested in their continuation. Indian society did not remain static under this pressure. Political consciousness evolved. Associations formed. Newspapers circulated ideas. Demands shifted from reform within empire to representation against it. Resistance moved from rebellion to organization. The Raj faced not just unrest, but critique. By the late 19th century, India stood as the empire's greatest achievement and its greatest burden. It delivered revenue, prestige, and strategic depth. It also exposed the limits of imperial legitimacy. Governing difference had proven possible, but not without cost. The machinery of empire functioned, but it did not reconcile. As India's role within the empire expanded, so too did the consequences of ruling it. The Raj had mastered administration, but it had not mastered consent. And consent, once demanded, cannot be indefinitely denied. By the turn of the 20th century, India was no longer merely the British Empire's most valuable possession. It had become its defining test. The Raj represented the empire at its most sophisticated, most confident, and most exposed. Here, Britain ruled not a frontier, but a civilization. And in doing so, it revealed both the height of its administrative power and the depth of its moral vulnerability. India was governed as a system. Revenue flowed with regularity. Railways carried goods, soldiers, and officials across thousands of miles. Courts processed cases with procedural consistency. Census data classified millions into categories legible to the state. On paper, the Raj appeared orderly, rational, and enduring. To British officials, it was proof that empire could be administered scientifically, through rules rather than whim, institutions rather than individuals. But beneath this surface lay strain. Economic reorientation had bound India tightly to imperial markets, leaving little buffer against global shocks. When prices fell or harvests failed, vulnerability spread rapidly. Famines exposed the limits of bureaucratic governance. Systems optimized for extraction proved slow to respond to human crisis. Relief existed, but it was conditional, measured, and often delayed. Efficiency had replaced empathy. At the same time, the cultural distance between ruler and ruled remained profound. British authority rested on claims of neutrality and progress, yet it was enforced through racial hierarchy and exclusion. Indians could serve the empire, but rarely shape it. Advancement was limited, representation constrained, power remained external. This contradiction increasingly defined the Raj. Indian political consciousness expanded within the very structures Britain had built. English education produced lawyers, journalists, and administrators fluent in imperial language. Railways and print connected regions and ideas. Associations formed. Debates intensified. What had begun as appeals for reform evolved into demands for participation and then for self-rule. The empire faced a dilemma of its own making. It had justified rule through competence and improvement. Now it was asked to prove those claims by sharing power. To concede risked unraveling authority. To refuse deepened resistance. The Raj, so carefully balanced, began to tilt. Britain responded cautiously. Reforms were introduced incrementally. Limited representation, consultative councils, symbolic inclusion. These measures aimed to preserve control while acknowledging pressure, but they satisfied neither imperial confidence nor nationalist ambition. The gap between expectation and reality widened. India's importance made retreat unthinkable. The subcontinent provided strategic depth, manpower, and economic weight unmatched elsewhere in the empire. It anchored Britain's global position. To lose India would mean more than territorial contraction. It would mean imperial redefinition. And yet, the cost of holding it was rising. The Raj demanded constant attention. Surveillance expanded, policing intensified, administration grew heavier. Each act of control generated new resistance, which demanded further control. The empire entered a cycle of maintenance rather than expansion. India had become the empire's mirror. In governing it, Britain confronted the full implications of its imperial logic, the belief that order justified domination, that efficiency could substitute for consent, that progress could be imposed. These assumptions, tested nowhere else at such scale, now showed their limits. The Raj did not collapse suddenly. It endured through adaptation, negotiation, and force. But its legitimacy eroded steadily. Authority remained, but belief weakened, and power without belief is brittle. For Britain, India reshaped imperial identity. It transformed the empire from a network of trade into a system of governance. It professionalized administration and centralized authority. It also politicized empire, drawing scrutiny, debate, and moral reckoning back to the metropole. By the early 20th century, it was clear that the future of the British Empire would be decided not in Europe or the Atlantic, but in how it resolved the question India posed. Can a distant power rule a vast, conscious society indefinitely without consent? The Raj had demonstrated what empire could achieve. It had also revealed what empire could not escape. As Britain moved forward, the lessons of India would follow, shaping a policy, provoking reform, and foreshadowing the empire's eventual transformation. The methods perfected in the Raj would be applied elsewhere. The contradictions exposed there would echo across the imperial world. India was the empire's center of gravity. And gravity, once shifted, changes everything. The chapter that follows will explore how this burden of rule began to strain the empire itself, challenged by resistance, reform, and the pressures of a changing world. By the dawn of the 19th century, British power no longer felt provisional. It felt permanent. The wars of the previous century had cleared the field. Rival empires had been weakened, displaced, or absorbed into Britain's expanding system. Trade routes bent toward British ports. Naval patrols enforced access across oceans. Law, finance, and administration radiated outward from London with growing confidence. Empire was no longer an experiment or an improvisation. It was a condition of global order. This was the imperial century. British authority now spanned continents not as scattered possessions, but as an interlinked structure. Colonies, protectorates, dominions, and informal spheres of influence operated within a shared framework of trade, law, and security. Some territories were governed directly. Others retained local rulers under imperial supervision. Still others remained nominally independent but economically bound to British markets. The empire did not insist on uniformity. It insisted on alignment. Naval dominance made this possible. Britain's fleets ensured that no rival could challenge its control of global sea lanes for long. The oceans, once frontiers of uncertainty, had become corridors of predictability. Ships moved on schedules, convoys reduced risk. Information traveled faster than ever before. Supremacy at sea allowed Britain to intervene selectively, projecting power without a continuous occupation. This efficiency reshaped how empire was perceived. British officials increasingly spoke of rule not as conquest, but as administration. Order replaced expansion as the defining imperial virtue. Stability became the justification for presence. The empire presented itself as a guarantor of global equilibrium, protecting trade, suppressing piracy, enforcing treaties, and resolving disputes. Power was framed as responsibility. This self-image mattered. The 19th century was an age of confidence, technological, political, and moral. Britain's industrial transformation amplified imperial reach. Steam power accelerated transport. Telegraphs collapsed distance. Factories produced goods at unprecedented scale. Industrial output fed global markets, binding distant societies into a single economic rhythm centered on Britain. Industrialization and empire reinforced each other. Colonies supplied raw materials. Markets absorbed manufactured goods. Infrastructure built overseas served extraction and control. Railways extended authority inland. Ports expanded capacity. Imperial administration synchronized local economies with global demand. At home, the effects were transformative. Britain became the workshop of the world. Wealth accumulated, cities expanded, social classes shifted. Political reform advanced unevenly, accommodating new economic realities. The empire appeared not as an external project but as an extension of national prosperity. Abroad, the picture was more complex. British rule imposed order but not equality. Legal systems privileged property and contract over custom. Free trade dismantled local protections. Economic integration benefited some and destabilized others. Traditional industries declined under competition. Dependency deepened. Prosperity flowed unevenly toward imperial centers. Yet the empire's confidence remained unshaken. British policymakers believed history itself favored their system. Free trade was framed as progress, law as civilization, administration as improvement. Where resistance emerged, it was interpreted as backwardness or misunderstanding rather than critique. The empire did not question its right to rule. It questioned only how best to rule. This normalization of power was the empire's defining feature in this era. Control became routine. Authority was exercised through procedure rather than spectacle. Officials governed by manuals, regulations, and precedent. Empire functioned not through constant force, but through daily compliance. But routine concealed strain. The scale of empire demanded constant management. Local crises required attention. Reforms generated unintended consequences. Industrial capitalism produced volatility, booms and busts that rippled across imperial networks. Social tensions rose within Britain itself as industrialization disrupted traditional life. Resistance abroad adapted as well. It became more organized, more political, more articulate. Movements emerged that spoke the language of rights and representation, often learned within imperial systems themselves. Critique sharpened. Still, from London's vantage point, the empire appeared secure. Its rivals were contained, its economy dominant, its navy unmatched. The 19th century seemed to confirm Britain's destiny as global arbiter. Yet empires are rarely undone at their weakest moment. They strain most when they appear strongest, when expansion gives way to maintenance, when confidence dulls perception, and when routine obscures warning. The imperial century had begun, and with it, the quiet pressure that would one day test the limits of British dominance. As the 19th century progressed, British imperial power settled into rhythm. Governance was no longer improvised, it was scheduled. Trade no longer ventured, it circulated. The empire ran on timetables of ships, trains, courts, and cables, each reinforcing the sense that order had been mastered and history aligned. Industrialization lay at the heart of this confidence. Steam transformed distance, railways compressed continents, carrying goods, officials, and soldiers into interiors once beyond easy reach. Telegraph lines stitched empire into a near instantaneous web of communication, allowing London to issue directives that echoed across oceans within hours. Information became power, not merely gathered, but synchronized. This technological acceleration reshaped imperial administration. Decisions could be centralized, crises managed remotely. Authority felt omnipresent, even where British personnel were few. The empire appeared to govern everywhere at once, not by presence alone, but by connectivity. Trade expanded accordingly. Britain's factories demanded raw materials at scale: cotton, coal, rubber, metals, drawing colonies ever deeper into extractive roles. In return, manufactured goods flooded global markets, undercutting local production and binding consumers to imperial supply chains. Free trade was enforced as principle and policy, opening markets whether they wished to be opened or not. This economic integration produced growth, but also fragility. Colonial economies reoriented toward export became vulnerable to global price swings. Local resilience diminished. Social dislocation followed. Urban centers grew unevenly. Rural populations faced pressure from land reforms and market dependency. These disruptions were often invisible to imperial planners, who measured success in aggregate figures rather than lived experience. At the same time, Britain's domestic society felt the empire's pull. Wealth from overseas investment flowed into banks and industries. Imperial trade stabilized employment in key sectors. Political influence increasingly reflected commercial interest. The empire was not distant, it was embedded in daily life. Yet industrial capitalism carried its own tensions. Economic cycles produced instability, labor unrest rose, calls for reform intensified. Britain prided itself on constitutional evolution, but reform was uneven, contested, and cautious. The empire's liberal self-image masked inequalities at home as well as abroad. Abroad, resistance adapted to the new order. Where earlier opposition had taken the form of revolt or rebellion, 19th century resistance often adopted political organization. Associations, petitions, and movements emerged that demanded rights within the imperial framework. Leaders used the empire's own language, law, liberty, representation, to challenge exclusion. Education, once a tool of control, became a medium of critique. British authorities responded ambivalently. Reform was offered selectively, enough to stabilize, not enough to transform. Inclusion was promised but limited. Governance aimed to manage dissent rather than resolve its causes. The empire sought equilibrium, not equality. Meanwhile, the empire's global role expanded beyond commerce into arbitration. Britain positioned itself as a guarantor of international order. It mediated disputes, enforced treaties, and intervened to protect perceived stability. This role reinforced prestige, but it also multiplied obligations. The empire became entangled in conflicts not of its making, compelled to act to preserve credibility. Naval dominance underwrote this posture. The Royal Navy's presence deterred challengers and reassured allies. Supremacy at sea allowed Britain to police the world without formal annexation. Influence could be exerted through access and denial rather than conquest. Yet this dominance was costly to maintain. Shipbuilding accelerated, Bases expanded, personnel multiplied, expenditure rose. The empire's security depended on continuous investment. Supremacy was no longer achieved, it was maintained. By mid-century, the empire appeared stable, but its foundations were under constant load. Administrative systems grew heavier, decision-making slowed, local complexity resisted standardization. The more Britain sought to regulate, the more it encountered variation it could not fully control. Confidence persisted, but perception narrowed. Imperial culture celebrated order, progress, and inevitability. Exhibitions displayed imperial reach. Maps depicted a world shaded by influence. The empire appeared as a fact of nature, self-sustaining and enduring. Few in power questioned whether the system could adapt indefinitely. Yet beneath routine lay accumulation. Economic dependency deepened. Political exclusion hardened. National identities coalesced. Grievances multiplied quietly, expressed through organization rather than explosion. The empire's strength, its systems, now constrained its flexibility. The illusion of permanence was powerful. But permanence, once assumed, dulls vigilance. The imperial century was approaching its midpoint, not with crisis but with saturation. Expansion slowed, maintenance dominated. The empire still ruled, but it no longer surprised itself. And in that complacency, the seeds of strain took root. By the late 19th century, the British Empire had become a constant rather than a conquest. Its presence was assumed, its authority normalized, its dominance woven into the everyday workings of global life. Empire no longer announced itself through expansion, it expressed itself through maintenance. And it was in this phase, quiet, managerial, and confident, that strain became most apparent. The empire had reached saturation. Territories were mapped, trade routes secured, administrative hierarchies established. What remained was the labor of continuity, governing diversity, managing contradiction, and responding to pressures that no longer came from rival empires alone, but from within the imperial system itself. Industrialization, once the empire's engine, now exposed its limits. The same technologies that compressed distance also accelerated comparison. Colonized societies could see the disparities embedded in imperial rule more clearly than ever before. Railways carried not only goods, but ideas. Print circulated critique. Education created a generation capable of articulating resistance in legal and political terms. Empire had taught its subjects how to speak back. British governance responded with calibration rather than transformation. Reforms were introduced cautiously. Expanded councils, limited representation, symbolic inclusion, designed to preserve authority while absorbing pressure. These measures acknowledged strain without addressing its causes. Power remained centralized. Decision-making stayed distant. The empire adjusted, but it did not yield. At home, Britain's imperial confidence masked anxiety. Industrial competition intensified. Other powers industrialized rapidly, narrowing Britain's economic advantage. Markets grew volatile. The cost of maintaining naval supremacy rose. The empire's global role demanded constant attention, stretching political focus and financial capacity. Imperial dominance was no longer uncontested. It was merely unchallenged enough. The moral dimension of empire also grew harder to ignore. Debates over labor, governance, and responsibility sharpened. Humanitarian critiques gained visibility. Reformers questioned whether order justified coercion, whether progress excused inequality. These debates did not dismantle empire, but they eroded certainty. Justification became defensive rather than declarative. Abroad, resistance matured. National movements formed with increasing coherence. Leaders articulated visions of self-rule, grounded not in rejection of modernity, but in claim to it. They demanded inclusion on imperial terms, and when denied, began to imagine alternatives beyond empire. Control now required negotiation as much as enforcement. The British state recognized the challenge but underestimated its depth. It viewed resistance as manageable, episodic, and local. It failed to see how interconnected these movements were becoming. how grievances shared a common structure across continents. The empire's global systems transmitted dissent as efficiently as they transmitted trade. Power, once expansive, became reactive. Administration grew heavier as complexity multiplied. Policies layered upon policies. Bureaucracy thickened. Flexibility diminished. The empire could still act decisively, but only with effort, and often too late. Momentum favored continuity, even when adaptation was required. Yet from a distance, the empire still appeared formidable. Maps remained shaded by influence. Trade volumes remained vast. Naval patrols maintained order. Britain continued to mediate global affairs with authority. The image of supremacy endured. This was the paradox of the imperial century. The empire was strongest in appearance precisely as its foundations began to strain. Its systems were mature, but maturity had brought rigidity. Its confidence was deep, but confidence had narrowed perception. Its power was real, but increasingly costly to exercise. History rarely announces turning points with collapse. More often they arrive through accumulation, through pressures normalized until they can no longer be absorbed. By the close of the 19th century, the British Empire stood as the most extensive and sophisticated system of global rule the world had known. It had reshaped economies, societies, and international order. It had normalized dominance and institutionalized inequality. But beneath routine lay tension. Beneath order lay contestation. Beneath confidence lay fragility. The imperial century had fulfilled its promise and revealed its limits. What followed would not be marked by sudden decline, but by challenge, from reformers, from subjects, from rival powers, and from history itself. The empire would be forced to respond, not as an unquestioned authority, but as a system under scrutiny. The next chapter will trace how resistance and reform began to converge, how the pressures accumulated during the imperial century would finally demand reckoning. For the age of unquestioned dominance was ending, and the age of challenge had begun. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire faced a challenge unlike any it had encountered before. This was not a rival fleet on the horizon, nor a battlefield crisis at the edge of empire. It was a confrontation of ideas, articulated in petitions, newspapers, assemblies, and streets, spoken in the empire's own language. Imperial rule had matured into routine, but resistance had matured with it. For much of the 19th century, dissent within the empire had been localized and fragmented. Revolts flared and were suppressed. Grievances were managed through force or concession. But as imperial administration expanded education, infrastructure, and communication, it inadvertently created the conditions for coordinated opposition. Railways carried people together. Print carried arguments farther than any army. Law schools produced advocates fluent in constitutional logic. The empire had trained its critics. Across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, political movements emerged that did not reject modernity but claimed it. Leaders invoked rights, representation, and self-determination not as foreign concepts, but as principles Britain itself professed to uphold. The contradiction was unavoidable. An empire that celebrated liberty at home denied it abroad. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in India. What had begun as reformist appeal gradually transformed into organized political resistance. Associations formed to petition for inclusion. Debates shifted from administrative improvement to political legitimacy. The language was measured, legal, and deliberate. Empire was being challenged not as chaos, but as inconsistency. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere. In settler colonies, demands for autonomy intensified. In African territories, resistance adapted to colonial structures, combining traditional authority with modern political organization. In the Caribbean, labor movements exposed the economic inequalities embedded in imperial trade. Each context differed, but the underlying critique converged. Control without consent was becoming untenable. Within Britain itself, reform movements amplified this pressure. Humanitarian campaigns questioned imperial labor practices. Intellectuals debated the moral cost of dominance. Journalists exposed abuses. Parliament debated responsibility. The empire was no longer a distant abstraction. It was a domestic concern. These critiques did not emerge from a single ideology. Some sought reform, others restraint. Some defended empire on ethical grounds, others opposed it outright. But together, they shifted the terms of debate. Empire could no longer justify itself solely through order and efficiency. It was now asked to answer moral questions. The British state responded with reform. Administrative structures were adjusted to include limited local participation. Advisory councils expanded, educational opportunities widened, legal protections were extended selectively. These reforms aimed to reconcile authority with legitimacy, to preserve control while acknowledging pressure. Yet reform was constrained by fear. Imperial officials worried that meaningful inclusion would accelerate demands they could not contain. Each concession risked precedent. Each expansion of representation threatened the logic of rule. As a result, reforms often arrived diluted, delayed, or unevenly applied. They addressed symptoms rather than causes. Colonial critics recognized this hesitation. Reform without power was seen as management, not justice. Promises of inclusion raised expectations faster than they delivered results. Frustration grew, not because change was absent, but because it was insufficient. The empire found itself in a bind of its own making. To maintain authority, it needed legitimacy. To preserve legitimacy, it needed consent. To grant consent, it needed to share power. And sharing power challenged the foundations of empire itself. This tension reshaped imperial governance. Surveillance expanded alongside reform. Policing intensified even as councils convened. The language of partnership coexisted with the reality of coercion. Empire oscillated between concession and control, never fully committing to either. Resistance adapted accordingly. Where petitions failed, protests followed. Where reforms stalled, movements radicalized. Political consciousness broadened beyond elites, reaching workers, students, and rural communities. The empire faced not isolated dissent, but a widening audience. By the early 20th century, British rule no longer rested on unquestioned authority. It rested on negotiation, pressure, and constant adjustment. Empire had become a conversation, unequal, tense, and unresolved. The age of passive rule was over. What lay ahead would test whether reform could stabilize an empire built on hierarchy, or whether resistance would outpace accommodation altogether. As resistance spread and confidence eroded, reform became the empire's chosen instrument, not as surrender, but as containment. British policymakers believed the empire could be stabilized through adjustment. Enough inclusion to relieve pressure, enough authority to retain control. Reform was not intended to end empire, it was intended to save it. This logic shaped imperial policy in the early 20th century. Across the empire, administrative reforms multiplied. Legislative councils were expanded. Local representatives were admitted into advisory roles. Educational access widened for select elites. Legal safeguards were refined. On paper, the empire appeared responsive, modernizing, inclusive, adaptive. In practice, power remained concentrated. Reforms were carefully calibrated. Representation was limited. Authority was retained by governors, viceroys, and imperial officials. Final decisions rested with the metropole. Participation was permitted, but only within boundaries defined by empire. Reform functioned as management rather than transformation. Nowhere was this clearer than in India. Constitutional changes promised gradual self-governance, yet delayed meaningful transfer of power. Local leaders debated budgets and policy, but ultimate authority remained external. The language of partnership masked asymmetry. Each reform raised expectations without resolving the central question: who ruled and by what right? The empire underestimated the psychological effect of this gap. For reformers within colonized societies, limited inclusion validated political organization. It demonstrated that pressure worked. Each concession proved that authority could be negotiated. Far from dampening resistance, reform legitimized it. Movements gained confidence, discipline, and reach. Dissent shifted from appeal to assertion. Political parties formed, labor unions organized, student movements mobilized. Print culture amplified critique. Empire was no longer addressed solely through petitions to authority. It was challenged through public engagement. Resistance became collective rather than elite. The empire's own systems of communication accelerated this transformation. British officials responded with caution and concern. Intelligence reports tracked agitation. Policing expanded. Emergency powers were invoked when unrest threatened order. The language of reform coexisted with the machinery of repression. Empire oscillated between persuasion and force. This duality eroded trust. Colonial populations saw reform as conditional and reversible. Each crackdown exposed the limits of inclusion. Promises rang hollow when contradicted by coercion. The empire's claim to moral authority weakened further. Within Britain, debate intensified. The cost of empire, financial, moral, and political, was increasingly scrutinized. Reformers argued that domination contradicted British values. Conservatives warned that retreat would invite chaos and diminish power. Public opinion fractured. Empire became a subject of controversy rather than consensus. Yet even critics often assumed continuity. The question was how empire should be governed, not whether it should exist. Few imagined rapid dissolution. The system appeared too vast, too integrated, too essential to unravel. The empire itself reinforced this assumption. Its administrators believed time favored stability. They trusted gradualism. They assumed resistance would fragment, reform would pacify, and authority would endure. This belief shaped policy and blinded it to momentum. Momentum favored dissent. Across the empire, movements learned from one another. Ideas traveled faster than officials anticipated. Strategies evolved. Resistance adopted discipline, organization, and moral framing. Empire faced not chaos, but coordination. The paradox deepened. The more the empire reformed, the more it acknowledged the legitimacy of demands it could not fully satisfy. The more it repressed, the more it undermined its moral claim. Control without consent required force. Force without legitimacy generated resistance. By the eve of global conflict, the empire stood at a delicate equilibrium, maintained through negotiation, surveillance, and restraint. It was still powerful. It was still functional. But it was no longer secure in its justification. Reform had become a holding pattern. Resistance had become a trajectory. The empire had delayed confrontation, but it had not resolved it. What would come next would not be decided solely by policy or principle, but by events beyond imperial control. Global forces, war, economic disruption, and shifting power were approaching. They would test whether an empire already strained by dissent could withstand crisis. The age of reform had stabilized the empire temporarily. But history rarely grants permanence to postponement. By the second decade of the 20th century, the British Empire had entered a new and uncertain phase. It still governed vast territories. Its fleets still ruled the seas. Its administrators still enforced law and order across continents. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Authority remained, but belief had weakened. The empire was no longer sustained by confidence alone. It was sustained by negotiation, pressure, and the hope that time would preserve what force alone could not. Resistance had become structural. What distinguished this era from earlier dissent was not intensity, but permanence. Opposition no longer appeared as episodic unrest to be suppressed and forgotten. It had become embedded in political life, organized, articulate, and increasingly national in scope. Movements demanded not reform within empire, but a voice equal to the authority that governed them. The empire struggled to respond because the challenge cut to its core. British rule had always justified itself through order, efficiency, and progress. Now it was asked to justify itself through consent. That demand exposed a contradiction empire could not easily reconcile. To grant full consent was to share sovereignty. To deny it was to abandon the moral language that had long defended imperial rule. This dilemma shaped every decision. Imperial administrators continued to refine governance, hoping that better management would substitute for legitimacy. Policies emphasized stability and gradual transition. Committees studied reform. Reports promised evolution. But delay bred impatience. Each postponement hardened suspicion that empire intended permanence, not partnership. Repression filled the gap. Reform could not bridge. Emergency laws expanded executive power. Censorship increased. Surveillance deepened. The empire sought to contain momentum without inflaming it. But containment required force, and force revealed fear. Each act of repression undermined the image of benevolent rule. Authority appeared increasingly defensive. Within Britain, the contradiction reverberated. Public debate intensified as reports from the empire exposed unrest and repression. Reformers questioned whether continued dominance aligned with national values. Critics warned that clinging to empire risked moral and political decay. Defenders argued that withdrawal would invite instability and diminish Britain's global standing. The empire was no longer a symbol of unity. It was a subject of dispute. Yet even as doubt spread, the empire persisted. Its institutions functioned. Its economy benefited from imperial ties. Its global influence remained real. The system did not collapse under critique. It adapted, absorbed, and deferred. But each adaptation required greater effort. The margin for error narrowed. Crucially, resistance movements had learned patience as well. They understood the empire's reliance on legitimacy. They framed their demands carefully. They appealed to international opinion. They exposed inconsistency rather than provoking chaos. This strategy eroded imperial authority without requiring immediate confrontation. It was resistance calibrated to outlast control. The empire had reached an impasse. Control could be maintained, but only at rising cost. Reform could be offered, but only within limits that disappointed its recipients. Consent, once invoked, could not be selectively granted without consequence. The empire's own language had become its constraint. By the eve of global war, British rule stood on conditional ground. It still governed, but it no longer commanded unquestioned acceptance. Its future depended increasingly on external events, on crises that could either reinforce authority or shatter its balance. Those events were approaching. War would demand loyalty, resources, and sacrifice on an unprecedented scale. It would test whether an empire strained by resistance could still mobilize unity. It would force Britain to make promises it might not be able to keep, and expose contradictions it could no longer postpone. Resistance and reform had not ended empire, but they had transformed it. The empire was no longer a settled order. It was a contested system, surviving through negotiation, tension, and delay. Its survival now depended less on strength than on circumstance. The next chapter will trace how global conflict accelerated these pressures, how war would push an already strained empire beyond reform and into reckoning. For when consent becomes the question, power alone can no longer provide the answer. In the summer of 1914, the British Empire entered a war it could not contain and would not survive unchanged. What began as a European conflict rapidly expanded into a global struggle that drew the empire's farthest reaches into its gravity. For the first time, Britain did not merely fight overseas. It fought with its empire, relying on it for men, material, and meaning. The scale was unprecedented. From the outset, Britain understood that victory would depend on mobilization far beyond the British Isles. The empire's vastness, once a symbol of confidence, now became a strategic necessity. Soldiers were recruited from India, Africa, the Caribbean, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Laborers built roads, carried supplies, and maintained lines of communication. Raw materials flowed from colonies into imperial factories. Food sustained armies. Ports became arteries of survival. The war transformed the empire from a system of governance into a machine of extraction and sacrifice. Billions answered the call, some voluntarily, others under pressure. They fought in climates and terrains far from home, trenches, deserts, mountains, and seas. Their contributions were essential, but their recognition uneven. The empire demanded loyalty, invoking shared purpose and imperial unity. In return, it offered promises of reform, inclusion, and eventual self-determination. These promises mattered. For many across the empire, participation in the war was framed as proof of maturity and entitlement. Service was not only sacrifice, it was leverage. If the empire required loyalty in its darkest hour, it would be expected to honor that loyalty afterward. War politicized contribution. At home, Britain itself was transformed. Industry was redirected entirely toward conflict. Society reorganized around survival. The financial costs soared. Debt accumulated. The empire's economic network strained under blockade, scarcity, and disruption. Victory was achieved, but at immense price. When the war ended, Britain emerged on the winning side, but weakened. The illusion of imperial invincibility had been shattered. Europe lay exhausted. Economies were destabilized. Social unrest simmered. The empire's authority, once grounded in confidence and inevitability, now rested on fragile justification. Britain had won the war, but lost certainty. More critically, the war exposed dependence. Britain could no longer pretend that the empire was a possession rather than a partnership. The conflict had demonstrated that imperial survival required colonial participation. The empire was not peripheral to Britain's strength. It was central to it. This realization altered relationships irreversibly. In the aftermath, reform was no longer optional. It was expected. Dominions pressed for recognition. Colonized societies demanded fulfillment of wartime promises. Veterans returned with new expectations shaped by shared sacrifice and global exposure. The language of rights and nationhood, amplified by war, spread rapidly. Empires across the world faced similar pressures, but Britain's scale made the challenge uniquely complex. The interwar years did not bring stability. Economic turmoil deepened with global depression. Trade faltered. Unemployment rose. Imperial resources were stretched thinner. Governance became reactive. Reform initiatives advanced unevenly, constrained by fear of fragmentation and loss of control. The empire attempted to restore balance, but the ground had shifted. Then came a second war, even more global, even more total. Once again, Britain mobilized its empire. Once again, it relied on colonial manpower, production, and loyalty. But the context had changed. The empire entered the conflict already strained, economically weakened, politically challenged, morally scrutinized. Victory would come again, but at cost the empire could no longer absorb. The Second War accelerated what the first had begun. Britain emerged victorious, but no longer dominant. New powers reshaped global order. Economic leadership shifted. Military supremacy was diluted. The empire's strategic value was undeniable, but its sustainability was not. Most importantly, the wars had changed perception. Colonial societies had seen Britain bleed. They had seen it depend. They had seen that empire was not destiny, but contingency. The aura of permanence dissolved. Demands for independence gained urgency and legitimacy. Wartime unity could not be prolonged indefinitely. The world wars did not end the British Empire outright, but they transformed it beyond recovery. What followed would not be managed decline alone, but redefinition. The relationship between Britain and its empire would have to change, whether by design or by force. The age of imperial certainty was over, and the reckoning was only beginning. The end of the First World War did not bring peace to the British Empire. It brought exposure. Victory had been secured through unprecedented sacrifice, yet the empire that emerged was not stronger, but more fragile. Britain stood among the victors, but it did so exhausted, indebted, and increasingly aware that the global balance of power had shifted beneath its feet. The war had altered the meaning of dominance. Britain's traditional advantages, naval supremacy, financial leadership, and industrial capacity, had been strained to their limits. Wartime borrowing bound Britain to foreign creditors. Industrial output struggled to reconvert. Trade routes disrupted by conflict did not return easily to pre-war rhythms. The empire remained vast, but its center was weakened. This weakness had consequences. Dominions that had contributed heavily to the war demanded greater autonomy. Their soldiers had fought not as subjects, but as partners. Their governments expected recognition. The imperial relationship adjusted accordingly. Britain could no longer dictate policy unilaterally. Authority had to be shared, or at least negotiated. This shift was subtle but decisive. The empire was no longer a hierarchy alone. It was becoming an association. Elsewhere, the pressure was sharper. In colonies without political autonomy, wartime promises of reform collided with post-war hesitation. Britain spoke of gradual progress, but economic instability constrained generosity. Reconstruction at home took priority. Reform abroad stalled. Frustration hardened into opposition. The global economy offered little relief. The interwar years were marked by volatility, culminating in depression. Trade contracted. Commodity prices collapsed. Colonial economies dependent on exports suffered disproportionately. Unemployment and poverty spread. The empire's economic integration, once a source of strength, became a vector of crisis. Britain responded defensively. Protectionist measures replaced free trade ideals. Imperial preference aimed to stabilize markets within the empire, binding colonies more tightly to British demand. This strategy preserved some stability, but it reinforced dependency and resentment. Economic policy increasingly prioritized survival over principle. Political unrest followed. Movements for independence gained momentum, drawing strength from economic hardship and unmet promises. Britain faced a choice between repression and reform, and often attempted both. Limited concessions were paired with surveillance and force. The empire sought equilibrium, but pressure mounted from all sides. Then, in 1939, the world descended into war again. The Second World War demanded total mobilization. Britain entered the conflict already diminished, relying even more heavily on imperial resources. Colonies supplied troops, labor, food, and raw materials at unprecedented scale. The empire became indispensable to survival. Yet this dependence reversed the logic of authority. Britain could not command unquestioned loyalty while denying political future. Wartime necessity forced new commitments. Promises of self-government multiplied. Cooperation required credibility. The empire's leaders understood that the war could not be won without participation, and participation required hope. The conflict reshaped global power irreversibly. New centers of influence emerged. Old empires weakened. Britain fought with resilience and determination, but it no longer set the terms of the world it helped to save. Victory came with assistance. Supremacy did not return. When the war ended, Britain faced reality. Its economy was exhausted, its infrastructure damaged, its global position altered. The empire, once a pillar of strength, now represented obligation without advantage. The costs of maintenance outweighed the benefits of control. More importantly, the moral landscape had shifted. The war had been fought in the name of freedom and self-determination. These ideals could not be selectively applied. Colonized peoples who had sacrificed for victory demanded consistency. The language of empire no longer aligned with the language of legitimacy. Britain recognized the inevitability of change. The empire could not be restored to its pre-war form. Reform could no longer be deferred. Independence was no longer hypothetical. It was imminent. The question was no longer whether the empire would transform, but how. World War had exposed the empire's dependence, accelerated its decline, and reshaped its relationships. Britain emerged victorious, but no longer imperial in the old sense. Authority would have to be redefined, relinquished, or reimagined. The age of empire had been tested by total war. It had not survived intact. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Britain stood among the victors. But the empire stood at a crossroads from which there was no return. The war had been won, yet the world that emerged bore little resemblance to the one Britain had entered in 1939. Power had shifted, expectations had hardened, and the imperial order, already strained by resistance and reform, now faced a reckoning it could no longer postpone. The war had reordered global hierarchy. New powers dominated the post-war landscape. Economic leadership no longer rested in London. Financial dependence limited British autonomy. Military victory had required alliances that diluted imperial authority. Britain remained influential, but it was no longer central. The empire's old role as global arbiter had passed to a new international system shaped by different priorities. Within this new order, empire appeared anachronistic. The contradiction was stark. Britain had fought a war framed as a defense of freedom, sovereignty, and national self-determination. It had mobilized colonial populations with promises of partnership and progress. Now, to deny those principles abroad would undermine them everywhere. The empire's moral foundation had eroded beyond repair. Colonial societies understood this clearly. Veterans returned with sharpened political awareness. Wartime mobilization had exposed millions to global ideas, new skills, and shared sacrifice. The myth of imperial invincibility was gone. Britain had needed its empire to survive. That dependence altered the balance of legitimacy irrevocably. Demands for independence intensified. They were no longer appeals, they were claims. Movements that had grown cautiously during the interwar years now advanced with urgency and mass support. Political organization expanded rapidly. Strikes, demonstrations, and negotiations followed. The language of inevitability shifted sides. Empire, once assumed permanent, now appeared provisional. Britain responded with realism. Exhausted economically and constrained strategically, it lacked the capacity and, increasingly, the will to enforce imperial control indefinitely. Military suppression risked global condemnation and internal instability. Reform without transfer of power risked paralysis. The calculus had changed. Withdrawal became policy. This transition was uneven and complex. Some territories moved toward independence through negotiation, others through conflict. Timelines varied, outcomes diverged, but the direction was unmistakable. Britain no longer sought to preserve empire as a system of rule. It sought to manage its dissolution. The empire's relationship with its dominions evolved first. Political autonomy hardened into sovereignty. Former colonies assumed control over their own defense, diplomacy, and economies. The imperial connection shifted from command to association. Elsewhere, the process was more turbulent. Partition, migration, and violence accompanied withdrawal in many regions. Borders drawn under imperial logic became sources of instability. Institutions designed for control struggled to transition into instruments of self-rule. The legacy of empire did not dissolve with authority. It lingered in structures, divisions, and expectations. For Britain, the transformation was profound. Empire had shaped national identity for centuries. Its retreat forced redefinition. Britain turned inward, rebuilding its economy and reassessing its place in the world. Influence did not vanish, but it changed form. Diplomatic networks, cultural ties, and economic relationships persisted beyond formal rule. The empire faded, but its imprint endured. World War had not destroyed the British Empire in a single stroke. It had made its continuation impossible. The wars had revealed the limits of power built on hierarchy in a world increasingly defined by participation. They had exposed the dependence behind dominance and the cost behind order. They had accelerated history, compressing decades of pressure into moments of decision. By the mid-20th century, the empire that had once spanned continents no longer governed them. Authority passed to new states. Sovereignty replaced subordination. The imperial century gave way to a post-imperial age. Yet the story did not end with withdrawal. The systems Britain had built, legal frameworks, trade networks, political institutions, continued to shape the world it left behind. The empire's decline did not erase its influence, it redistributed it. World at war had transformed Britain from imperial ruler to global participant. What followed would not be measured in conquest or command, but in legacy, in how the structures of empire outlived the empire itself. The next chapter will follow that final passage, from rule to retreat, and from empire to aftermath. In the years after 1945, the British Empire entered its final phase, not with a dramatic fall, but with a deliberate retreat. The age of command was over. What remained was the task of disentanglement, complex, uneven, and irreversible. Britain did not abandon empire in a single act of surrender. It dismantled it piece by piece, guided by necessity rather than nostalgia. The war had changed everything. Britain emerged victorious but exhausted, economically weakened, politically constrained, and strategically overextended. The costs of reconstruction at home outweighed the benefits of imperial maintenance abroad. The empire, once a source of strength, had become a liability. Resources were finite, choices were unavoidable. Decolonization did not begin as a moral crusade. It began as a calculation. British policymakers understood that the post-war world no longer tolerated imperial rule. International norms had shifted. New institutions championed sovereignty and self-determination. Former colonies demanded independence not as aspiration, but as entitlement. Britain could resist, but resistance risked isolation, instability, and conflict it could no longer afford. Withdrawal became policy. Yet this withdrawal was not chaotic. Britain sought to manage the end of empire through negotiation, transition, and institutional continuity. Power was transferred gradually, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes under pressure. Independence was framed as evolution rather than rupture. The empire dissolved through agreements, acts of parliament, and staged handovers. This approach reflected Britain's enduring belief in administration. Where possible, colonial institutions were preserved, civil services were localized, legal systems adapted, military responsibilities transferred. Britain aimed to leave behind functioning states, not because it controlled outcomes, but because disorder threatened long-term influence. The results were mixed. In some regions, independence unfolded relatively peacefully. Negotiated settlements allowed new governments to assume authority with continuity and recognition. Former colonies entered the international system with inherited frameworks of law, governance, and trade. The imperial presence receded, but its structures endured. Elsewhere, withdrawal was traumatic. Partition accompanied independence in regions where imperial borders had masked deep divisions. Migration followed violence. New states emerged amid instability and unresolved conflict. Britain's desire for orderly exit collided with realities it could not fully manage or undo. Decisions made under pressure left lasting consequences. Throughout this process, Britain maintained a careful posture. It relinquished sovereignty but sought to retain influence. Diplomatic ties replaced command. Economic relationships persisted. Cultural and institutional connections endured. Empire did not vanish. It transformed. For Britain itself, the transition was disorienting. Empire had defined national purpose for generations. Its dissolution forced reassessment. Britain turned inward, focusing on reconstruction, welfare, and economic renewal. Its global role shifted from ruler to partner, from arbiter to participant. Influence remained, but it was no longer unquestioned. The end of rule did not erase Britain's imperial legacy. Borders drawn under empire remained, institutions persisted, trade patterns endured. Former colonies navigated independence within structures shaped by imperial logic. Britain, too, continued to engage the world through networks forged during empire. Decolonization was not an ending, it was a passage. The empire dissolved not because it collapsed, but because it could no longer be sustained. Its end was shaped by pressure, pragmatism, and adaptation. Britain withdrew step by step, leaving behind a world profoundly marked by its presence. The age of empire had given way to an age of nations. And Britain, having ruled much of the world, now faced the challenge of redefining itself within it. As Britain's withdrawal gathered pace, decolonization revealed its most difficult truth. Empires do not simply leave, they leave behind consequences. Independence transferred sovereignty, but it didn't erase history. New nations emerged carrying the weight of inherited borders, institutions, and expectations shaped under imperial rule. Freedom arrived, but rarely on clean terms. The process unfolded unevenly. In territories where political organization was mature and negotiations possible, independence followed a path of managed transition. Power passed through conferences, constitutions, and elections. British administrators departed as local governments assumed responsibility. Continuity was emphasized. The imperial hand receded gradually, allowing new states to stabilize before standing alone. Yet even in these cases, inheritance was complex. Legal systems, civil services, and military structures reflected imperial priorities rather than local design. Economies remained tied to global markets through trade patterns forged under empire. Political culture had developed within colonial frameworks, balancing aspiration with constraint. Independence did not dissolve dependency, it reconfigured it. Elsewhere, withdrawal collided with division. Imperial borders had often contained multiple identities within single administrative units. As authority dissolved, these divisions surfaced with force. In regions marked by religious, ethnic, or regional tension, independence arrived alongside partition. Boundaries drawn in haste divided communities, displaced millions, and ignited violence. Britain sought order, but time, trust, and capacity were insufficient. Partition revealed the limits of managed exit. Decisions made to prevent prolonged conflict sometimes created new instability. Migration followed borders, violence followed uncertainty, states were born amid trauma. The imperial promise of orderly transition faltered under the speed of history. Britain did not fully control these outcomes. Its ability to shape events declined as authority transferred. Negotiations were constrained by urgency and exhaustion. Withdrawal timelines compressed. The empire's final acts were often reactive rather than deliberate. Responsibility blurred as power passed, and consequences multiplied. Across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, independence movements accelerated. Some were peaceful, others were forged through struggle. The empire responded pragmatically, recognizing that continued control invited resistance, international condemnation, and economic strain. The calculus favored departure. Throughout this period, Britain sought to preserve relationships beyond rule. New states were encouraged to remain within cooperative frameworks. Diplomatic ties were emphasized. Economic assistance offered selectively. Cultural and educational links sustained. Britain aimed to transform imperial connection into association. This effort reflected realism. The post-imperial world did not erase influence, it redistributed it. Former colonies retained legal traditions, administrative practices, and institutional memory shaped by empire. English remained a global language of governance and commerce. Trade networks persisted, influence endured without sovereignty. Yet for new nations, independence demanded negotiation with inheritance. They faced the task of adapting institutions not designed for self-rule at scale. They confronted economies oriented toward export rather than development. They navigated social divisions sharpened under imperial management. Nationhood required reinvention as much as liberation. For Britain, the end of rule forced humility. Its global role contracted. Military commitments narrowed. Economic priorities shifted toward Europe and domestic reconstruction. The empire that had once defined British identity receded into memory and legacy. Britain remained influential, but as one actor among many. Decolonization also reshaped global order. Dozens of new states entered international institutions, altering diplomacy and politics worldwide. The language of sovereignty gained force. Imperial hierarchy gave way to formal equality, if not always substantive parity. The world Britain had helped to organize now operated by different rules. Yet the imperial past did not disappear. Its imprint lingered in borders, conflicts, alliances, and institutions. Decolonization closed the chapter of rule, but opened chapters of adjustment, struggle, and redefinition. The end of empire was not a clean break. It was an ongoing process. By the mid-20th century, Britain had relinquished most of its empire. Authority had passed, flags had changed, governments had formed. But history does not withdraw with ceremony. It remains in systems, in memory, and in the challenges inherited by those who follow. The end of rule marked not an erasure, but a transformation of Britain, of its former colonies, and of the world they now shared. By the late 20th century, the British Empire had ceased to exist as a system of rule, but it had not vanished as a force in the world. What remained was an afterlife, diffuse, enduring, and deeply embedded in the structures of modern global life. The end of rule marked the conclusion of sovereignty, not of influence. Britain's withdrawal reshaped its own national identity. For generations, empire had provided purpose, prestige, and direction. Its dissolution forced Britain to confront a more constrained role. Power was no longer assumed. It was negotiated. Foreign policy shifted from command to diplomacy. Military reach narrowed, economic ambition reoriented. Britain learned to operate within systems it once dominated. This transition was not seamless. Post-imperial Britain struggled with memory and meaning. The empire had ended without a single defining moment of collapse, leaving ambiguity in its place. Pride and regret coexisted. Achievement and injustice were debated. The imperial past became contested terrain, interpreted differently across generations and communities. Yet Britain adapted. It invested in alliances rather than possessions. It relied on diplomacy rather than decree. Its influence persisted through finance, culture, and institutions rather than governance. Former colonies became partners, competitors, and critics, no longer subjects. The imperial relationship transformed into a global network shaped by history but governed by sovereignty. For newly independent states, the afterlife of empire proved complex. Freedom brought opportunity but also burden. Governments inherited administrative systems designed for control, not participation. Borders drawn under imperial logic became sources of tension. Economies oriented toward extraction required diversification. National identity had to be forged from societies long managed through division. Some states navigated this transition successfully. Others faced prolonged instability. Outcomes varied widely, but none escaped the imprint of empire. Decolonization did not erase the past. It redistributed responsibility for its legacy. Across the world, the British Empire's structures continued to function in altered form. Legal systems endured, parliamentary models were adapted, trade routes persisted. English remained a global language of governance, education, and commerce. These continuities reflected both resilience and constraint, tools inherited, not always chosen. The empire's moral reckoning remained unresolved. Debates over responsibility, restitution, and memory intensified. Former colonies demanded recognition of harm alongside acknowledgement of shared history. Britain grappled with how to remember an empire that had shaped the modern world while inflicting profound injustice. History resisted simplification. What became clear was this: empire did not end because it was defeated militarily, nor because it was rejected morally in a single act. It ended because it could no longer align power with legitimacy. The costs of rule outweighed its benefits. The world it had helped to create no longer required imperial hierarchy to function. Decolonization closed the chapter of British rule, but it opened a global conversation about governance, sovereignty, and historical responsibility that continues today. The empire's end was not an event confined to the mid-20th century. It was, and remains, a process unfolding across institutions, borders, and identities. By relinquishing empire, Britain did not step outside history. It re-entered it, changed, constrained, and compelled to reckon with its past. The end of rule was not silence. It was transition. What followed would be measured not in territory held, but in influence adapted, not in authority imposed, but in relationships negotiated. The imperial age had given way to a post-imperial world, one shaped by the legacy of British rule, but no longer governed by it. The empire was gone, but the world it shaped remained. And in that world, the story of Britain would continue, not as ruler of many, but as one nation among many, living with the consequences of having once ruled the globe. The British Empire did not end with a final proclamation, nor did it dissolve into silence. It receded, leaving behind traces that continue to shape the modern world in ways both visible and concealed. Long after the lowering of flags and the transfer of authority, the empire's imprint remained embedded in institutions, habits, and expectations. Empire did not vanish. It echoed. These echoes are everywhere. Legal systems across continents still bear the structure of British common law. Courts operate with procedures and principles developed under imperial administration. Parliamentary models, adapted and reinterpreted, govern states that once existed within Britain's imperial orbit. English persists as a language of governance, commerce, and education, linking societies that share little else in common. Trade routes established under empire continue to influence economic patterns, often reinforcing inequalities first introduced under colonial rule. This continuity is not accidental. Empire was not merely a political system, it was an infrastructure of organization. It standardized law, administration, and economic exchange at global scale. When formal rule ended, these systems did not disappear. They were inherited. New states adapted what they received, but adaptation did not erase origin. The modern world carries the architecture of empire even where sovereignty has long since shifted. Yet legacy is not neutral. Alongside institutions came division. Borders drawn for administrative convenience became fault lines of conflict. Economic systems designed for extraction created dependency that proved difficult to reverse. Social hierarchies hardened under imperial classification persisted after independence. The empire's order imposed coherence, but often at the cost of cohesion. These consequences remain contested. For some, imperial legacy represents stability and continuity, foundations upon which modern states were built. For others, it symbolizes dispossession, coercion, and injustice, structures that constrain development and entrenched inequality. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive. They coexist, often uneasily, within the same societies. Britain itself remains bound to this legacy. The end of empire did not resolve questions of identity. It multiplied them. Britain's global role diminished, but its historical influence did not. Debates over responsibility, memory, and restitution gained prominence. The empire became not a source of certainty, but a subject of interrogation. This interrogation intensified as former colonies asserted their own narratives. History, once written largely from the metropole, fractured into multiple perspectives. Imperial achievements were reassessed alongside imperial harm. Monuments were questioned, archives revisited, memory became contested terrain. The empire's story could no longer be told as a single arc of progress or decline. It demanded plurality. Global politics reflected this complexity. Former imperial relationships evolved into diplomatic, economic, and cultural networks shaped by shared history, but governed by sovereignty. Influence persisted, but unevenly. Britain no longer commanded outcomes, but it still participated in systems it had helped to create. The empire's afterlife was not dominance, it was entanglement. Economically, patterns established under empire proved resilient. Many former colonies remained tied to global markets through roles defined decades earlier. Diversification was uneven. Development trajectories varied. The promise that independence alone would resolve inequality proved optimistic. History weighed heavily on possibility. At the same time, post-imperial agency expanded. Former colonies reinterpreted inherited institutions, asserting autonomy within constraint. Legal systems were localized, political models adapted, cultural expression flourished beyond imperial frameworks. The empire's imprint did not determine destiny, but it shaped the terrain upon which destiny was pursued. This duality defines the after-empire world. The British Empire no longer governs, but it continues to matter. Its influence persists not through control, but through structure. Its contradictions remain unresolved, debated across classrooms, parliaments, and public squares. The empire's legacy is neither wholly condemned nor wholly celebrated. It is examined. History has moved on, yet it has not moved away. Empires do not disappear when they end. They leave behind systems, memories, and questions that outlast authority. The British Empire is no exception. Its afterlife is written not in decrees, but in daily reality, in laws followed, languages spoken, and borders crossed. This chapter is not about nostalgia or judgment. It is about recognition. To understand the modern world, its alignments, its tensions, its unfinished debates, one must understand how empire continues to echo through it, not as a ruling force, but as a shaping one. The empire is gone, but its shadow remains. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the legacy of the British Empire shifted from policy to memory, from governance to meaning. The questions that now surrounded empire were no longer about rule, but about responsibility. How should the past be remembered? Who gets to define it? And what obligations, if any, does history impose on the present? These questions did not arise in isolation. They emerged as former colonies consolidated national identities, and as Britain itself grappled with a post-imperial reality shaped by migration, multiculturalism, and global interdependence. The empire, once distant, now lived within Britain's own society. Its legacy was no longer external, it was domestic. Migration made this unavoidable. Millions of people from former colonies settled in Britain, drawn by economic ties and legal pathways forged under empire. They brought languages, cultures, and histories shaped by British rule. The imperial past returned not as memory alone, but as lived experience. Britain's identity expanded, and with it debate over belonging, heritage, and accountability. Public memory became contested. Statues, museums, and curricula were re-examined. Figures once celebrated without question were reassessed. Imperial achievements were weighed against imperial violence. The empire's story fractured into competing interpretations, some emphasizing order and development, others emphasizing exploitation and harm. These debates were not merely academic. They reflected struggles over national identity and moral responsibility. Former colonies engaged in similar reassessments. Independence allowed space to reinterpret history from local perspectives. Colonial narratives were challenged. Archives were revisited. Education shifted. Yet the imperial past remained deeply embedded. Institutions inherited under empire continued to structure daily life. Language, law, and administration persisted even as their meanings were renegotiated. This process was uneven and ongoing. Some societies sought to reform inherited systems radically. Others adapted them pragmatically. In many cases, the legacy of empire constrained as much as it enabled. Economic inequality rooted in colonial structures proved difficult to dismantle. Political institutions designed for control struggled to deliver representation at scale. History shaped possibility. Internationally, the afterlife of empire influenced global relationships. Former imperial powers and former colonies navigated diplomacy through a shared but unequal past. Development aid, trade agreements, and strategic partnerships carried implicit histories of dependency and mistrust. Calls for reparations, restitution, or apology surfaced periodically, reflecting unresolved grievances. Responses varied, from acknowledgement to resistance to silence. Britain's position was ambivalent. It recognized the historical reality of empire, yet struggled to articulate a coherent moral stance. Official narratives oscillated between pride and regret. Apologies were rare and cautious. Responsibility was acknowledged selectively. The past remained politically sensitive, too complex for simple resolution, too present to ignore. What became clear was that empire's legacy could not be contained within national borders. The global system itself bore its imprint. International law, financial institutions, and trade norms reflected assumptions shaped during imperial expansion. Power remained unevenly distributed. The promise of equal sovereignty existed alongside structural inequality. Empire had ended, but its architecture endured. At the same time, agency expanded. Former colonies asserted influence within international institutions. Cultural exchange diversified global discourse. New centers of power emerged. The world Britain once dominated became multipolar. Imperial legacy shaped the starting conditions, but it did not dictate the outcome. This tension defines the after-empire era. History matters, but it does not determine everything. Legacy constrains, but it also provides tools. The challenge lies in recognizing inheritance without being bound by it, in acknowledging harm without freezing identity in grievance. The British Empire's afterlife is not a single story. It is a dialogue, sometimes constructive, sometimes confrontational, between past and present. It plays out in politics and culture, in economics and education, in how societies understand themselves and one another. Empires do not vanish when flags are lowered. They linger in systems, in memory, and in questions that refuse easy answers. The British Empire is gone as a political entity, but as a historical force, it remains active, shaping debates about justice, identity, and global order. Its echoes are neither wholly negative nor wholly redeeming. They are complex, unresolved, and enduring. The after-empire world is not defined by what Britain ruled, but by how that rule continues to be interpreted, challenged, and transformed. History does not close its chapters neatly. It leaves them open, inviting reassessment with each generation. In the final reckoning, Satyap, the legacy of the British Empire resists closure. It cannot be contained within monuments or anniversaries, nor resolved through apology or denial alone. It persists because it shaped the conditions under which the modern world emerged, and because those conditions continue to influence how power, inequality, and identity are lived today. Empire's most enduring inheritance is structural. The global order that followed decolonization did not begin from a blank slate. States entered independence with borders already drawn, economies already integrated, and institutions already defined. These inheritances shaped policy choices and constrained alternatives. Some adapted them successfully, others struggled beneath their weight. In either case, the past framed the present. This framing remains visible in patterns of inequality. Many former colonies continue to navigate development paths shaped by extractive economies and external dependence. Trade structures forged under empire proved resilient. Financial systems favored established centers. Political institutions inherited under colonial rule sometimes struggled to reconcile representation with stability. These challenges cannot be explained by empire alone, but neither can they be separated from it. At the same time, imperial legacy has been a source of connection. Shared language facilitated diplomacy and exchange. Legal frameworks enabled continuity. Cultural ties fostered dialogue across borders. Former colonies have reappropriated inherited systems to serve new purposes, asserting agency within constraint. The empire's tools did not dictate outcomes, but they influenced how outcomes were pursued. For Britain, the after-empire era has been one of recalibration. Freed from the burden of rule, Britain became one actor among many, still influential but no longer commanding. Its global role shifted toward mediation, cooperation, and participation in multilateral systems. The empire's end did not diminish Britain's relevance, but it transformed it. This transformation remains unfinished. Britain continues to negotiate its imperial memory in public life, education, and policy. Debates over commemoration and responsibility reflect broader questions about national identity in a post-imperial multicultural society. The empire's history is neither erased nor settled. It is contested and reinterpreted. Former colonies undertake similar negotiations. Independence did not dissolve history. It expanded the space to engage with it. Narratives once suppressed emerged. Cultural identities flourished. Political visions diverged. Yet the imperial past remains a reference point, invoked, challenged, or revised as societies define themselves on their own terms. Internationally, the afterlife of empire shapes how power is understood. Calls for equity in global governance reflect recognition that historical advantage persists. Movements for restitution and reform speak to unresolved imbalance. The language of sovereignty coexists with structural inequality, a tension rooted in imperial history but carried forward by modern systems. What distinguishes the present is not the absence of empire, but the visibility of its consequences. Empires once presented themselves as inevitable. Their end reveals contingency. The British Empire rose through adaptation, expanded through commerce and force, and ended through pressure, exhaustion, and change. Its legacy teaches that power endures only when legitimacy evolves, and that systems outlast rulers. This lesson extends beyond Britain. The story of the British Empire is not unique. It reflects broader truths about how global order is constructed, maintained, and transformed. Empires shape worlds, but they do not own them forever. Their influence persists not through domination, but through inheritance. After empire, history does not conclude. It continues, reworked by those who live with its consequences and reinterpret its meaning. The British Empire's echoes remain audible in law and language, in borders and debates, in memory and movement. They do not dictate the future, but they inform it. To acknowledge this is not to romanticize empire, nor to reduce it to atrocity alone. It is to recognize complexity, to accept that history produces both harm and structure, injustice and continuity. The British Empire has ended, but its legacy endures, not as a ruling force, but as a shaping presence in a world still negotiating the balance between power and consent, order and equity, past and possibility. And in that negotiation, history remains active, not as command, but as context. Empires fall, their echoes remain, and it is in listening to those echoes that the modern world understands itself.